She had burned her hands on a cast iron skillet at 4 in the morning, and she still had 8 more hours of this rattling hell to survive. The Arizona desert didn't care about Maeve Holloway. Neither did the railroad, the passengers, or the man in the wool suit who'd just thrown his breakfast plate back through the kitchen window because the eggs weren't soft enough. She picked the plate off the floor, set it on the counter, and went back to work. Because that was what you did when you had nothing left but the work itself. If you've ever watched someone hold themselves together through sheer stubbornness alone, leave a like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Stay until the end. You won't regret it. The Southern Pacific Line that cut through the Arizona Territory in the summer of 1883 was not built for comfort. It was built for cargo, copper ore, cattle, crates of goods moving west, settlers moving anywhere that wasn't where they'd already failed. The passenger cars swayed and shuddered on tracks that hadn't been properly graded, and the dining car at the rear of the train existed not because the railroad cared whether its passengers ate well, but because a hungry traveler was a complaining traveler, and a complaining traveler sometimes talked to journalists. Maeve Holloway had been the cook on the Flagstaff line for 11 months. She'd taken the job in October of the previous year, 3 weeks after burying her father in a borrowed suit, with $40 left to her name, a 12-year-old sister named Delia, who needed shoes, and the singular understanding that sentiment was a luxury she could not currently afford. She was 23 years old. She looked older. She knew it. The kitchen, if you could call it that, was a narrow galley pressed between the supply closet and the rear wall of the dining car. There was a cast iron range bolted to the floor, a prep counter the width of a church pew, 2 hanging shelves that rattled everything off them when the train took a hard curve, and a ventilation grate above the range that did very little ventilating. In August, with the desert sun hammering the roof of the car from outside and the range burning from inside, the temperature in that galley could reach 115 degrees. Maeve had learned to keep a wet rag tucked into her apron pocket. She used it to wipe her face, cool her wrists, and occasionally press against the back of her neck when she felt the particular brightness behind her eyes that meant she was getting close to something bad. She had not told anyone she was getting close to something bad. She did not plan to. Miss Holloway. The voice came through the service window, that rectangular opening in the partition wall through which she passed plates and through which passengers occasionally passed their opinions back. She recognized the voice before she turned. Mr. Aldous Fenwick, traveling to Tucson on what he had mentioned 3 separate times, was very important business. He was perhaps 50, wearing a suit that cost more than Maeve made in 6 months, and he had the look of a man who had never once been told that he was wrong about anything. She turned. "Yes, sir." "This is the 3rd morning," he said, "that my eggs have arrived cold." She looked at the plate in his hand. The eggs were not cold. She had plated them 60 seconds ago. She had watched the steam rise off them not 2 minutes before. "I apologize for that," she said. "Do you?" He set the plate down on the counter edge, not back through the window, just on the edge, so she'd have to reach for it. A small power, but he seemed to enjoy it. "Because I've been on this line before, and the cook before you managed perfectly well. I'm not sure what the difficulty is." The cook before her had been a man named Gerald Pruitt, who, according to the railroad steward, had been let go for drinking on shift and once serving a passenger, something that may or may not have been spoiled pork. Maeve was not going to say that. "I'll remake the eggs," she said. "How do you take them?" "I've told you twice." "Over easy," she said. "I remember, I wanted to confirm." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone deciding whether to continue the conversation or whether he'd already extracted enough satisfaction from it. Then he turned and went back to his table. Maeve pulled the plate through the window, tipped the eggs into the waste pail, and started over. Her hands were not entirely steady. She'd been on shift since 3 in the morning. Breakfast prep started long before the passengers stirred, and she was running on 4 hours of sleep and a cup of coffee she'd finished before dawn. Behind her, through the thin partition wall, she could hear the dining car filling up. The morning rush, such as it was on a train, a scattered collection of travelers at odd hours, some eating early, some barely awake. She could hear the specific sounds of people settling, chairs scraping, the clink of coffee cups, low conversation that rose and fell with the rhythm of the tracks. She worked faster. 2 orders of flapjacks for the couple in the 3rd booth, steak and potatoes for the cattle buyer who always ate before 7, biscuits and gravy for the family of 4 who'd boarded in Yuma and were headed all the way to New Mexico. She moved through it the way she moved through everything. Not gracefully exactly, but efficiently. She'd learned early that grace was something you performed for other people. Efficiency was something you did for yourself. The range flared hot. She adjusted the damper, shifted the pan, checked the biscuits in the lower oven. The wet rag came out of her pocket. She pressed it against her forehead, put it back. The steward, a thin man named Harold Briggs, who'd been on this line longer than anyone, pushed through the galley door at 7:15 with a look she'd learned to dread. "Table 4 wants to know if we have kippers," he said. "We don't have kippers." I told them that. "Then why are you telling me?" Harold spread his hands. "Because the man at table 4 asked to speak to the cook directly, and I am choosing to spare you that by asking on his behalf whether perhaps we have kippers." "We don't have kippers, Harold." "Right." He wrote something in his order book that was clearly not kippers. "And the eggs for Fenwick?" "Coming." He looked at her with an expression that held a careful amount of nothing. Harold Briggs had learned, in 11 months, that Maeve did not want his sympathy and would not accept his pity, and sometimes got irritated even by his concern. So he'd settled into a policy of professional neutrality that she appreciated more than she'd ever tell him. "Fenwick is a difficult man," he said finally. "Most of them are." He went back out. She plated the eggs, precisely this time, over easy, the whites just set and the yolks still trembling, and passed them through the window. Delia was asleep in the supply closet. This was not technically permitted. Passengers were not allowed in the service areas of the train, and Delia, at 12, occupied a gray space in this policy. She wasn't exactly a passenger, since Maeve couldn't afford to buy her a seat, and she wasn't exactly staff, since she was 12. The arrangement they'd settled into was that Delia rode in the supply closet on the morning runs, and in the kitchen during the slower afternoon hours when Maeve could keep an eye on her, and Harold was unlikely to walk in unexpectedly. It was not a good arrangement. Maeve was aware of this. She was aware of it every time she thought about Delia sleeping on a folded-up canvas tarp between sacks of flour and crates of canned goods, which was most of the time. She didn't have a better one. Their mother had died 4 years ago, when Maeve was 19 and Delia was 8. Their father, Thomas Holloway, had kept them together through a combination of stubbornness and odd jobs, and a particular talent for convincing people to extend him credit. One more week, just one more week, until the week came when there was no more credit to extend. He'd gotten sick in September, chest trouble that turned to pneumonia, and by early October he was gone. He left them the contents of a rented room, a pocket watch that Maeve had since sold, and the understanding that from here on out they were on their own. Maeve had found the railroad job through a notice posted at a dry goods store in Phoenix. She'd lied about her experience. She said she'd cooked at a hotel in St. Louis, which was half true in that she'd once worked briefly in a hotel kitchen in a different capacity. And she'd gotten the job because the railroad was desperate, and Harold Briggs, who'd interviewed her, had a practical eye for people who weren't going to quit after the first hard week. She hadn't quit. Some weeks she'd thought about it. She hadn't. The pay was $7 a week, which was not enough for 2 people, which meant she stretched it in ways she didn't discuss with anyone. She ate whatever was left in the kitchen at the end of the service, the food that couldn't be held over, the ends of things. She bought Delia's shoes secondhand and let out the seams of her own dresses when they got tight across the shoulders and tight across the hem. She kept $1 in a tobacco tin under the floorboard of their rented room in Flagstaff, which she touched only when she absolutely had to, which meant she'd touched it twice. Delia knew some of this, not all of it. Maeve had decided when she was 19 and realized she was now the person in charge, that there were things Delia could know and things she couldn't. A 12-year-old didn't need to know how close they were to nothing. She just needed to believe that Maeve had a handle on it. Maeve wasn't always sure she had a handle on it. She never said so. By 9 in the morning, the breakfast rush had thinned. The range cooled slightly. She kept a low fire going for the coffee urn, and Maeve finally had a moment to drink something herself. She poured a cup, leaned against the prep counter, and let herself stop moving for the first time since 3 a.m. Through the service window, she could see the dining car in its post-breakfast state. Scattered cups, crumpled napkins, a few passengers lingering with coffee or staring out at the desert rolling past. The landscape through the window was brutal and enormous, ochre and rust and bone white, broken by scrub brush and the occasional saguaro standing against the blue sky like it was making some kind of statement. She'd grown up in Kansas. She still wasn't used to Arizona. At the table nearest the kitchen window, table 2, the one she could see clearly without leaning, a man sat alone. He'd been there since the early part of breakfast. She'd noticed him in the peripheral way she noticed everyone, but she hadn't taken a proper look. He'd ordered quietly and eaten without complaint, which put him in a category that contained maybe a quarter of the passengers she served, and which meant she'd filed him away as not a problem and moved on. Now in the quiet, she looked. He was maybe 28, 29, lean in the way of men who'd done outdoor work for years. Not the kind of lean that came from not enough to eat, but the kind that came from a body that never stopped working. He wore trail clothes, not dirty, but lived in, the kind of worn-in leather and cotton that meant he'd been somewhere for a while and recently come back from it. His hat sat on the table beside his coffee cup. He had dark hair, needed a cut, and he was reading something. A letter, she thought, folded pages that he turned with a careful economy of motion. He didn't look up. She wasn't sure why she kept looking. She finished her coffee, set the cup down, and went back to work. Chet. At 11, Aldous Fenwick came back to the window. She heard him before she saw him. The precise, controlled knock on the partition. 3 times. That meant a passenger wanted attention and was expressing that want through the architecture of the train because they didn't want to have to raise their voice. She came to the window. "The flapjacks this morning," he said, "were gummy." She'd made the flapjacks at 6 a.m. It was now 11. "I'm sorry to hear that. I'm telling you because it will happen again tomorrow if nothing changes." He spoke with the patient tone of someone explaining a simple concept to someone of limited understanding. "The ratio of flour to liquid. It's a basic thing." "Yes, sir." "And the coffee." He set his cup on the ledge. "This has been sitting too long." It had been on the urn for 40 minutes, which was not too long by any standard she was aware of, but she took the cup, poured it out, refilled it from the fresh pot she'd started 20 minutes ago, and passed it back. "Is there anything else?" she asked. He looked at her. There was a pause that felt deliberate, a beat held just long enough to make her wait. "You're very young to be doing this job," he said. She didn't answer. "I'm making an observation." "I understood that." He took the coffee. "You have a sharp tongue for a railroad cook." "I apologize if I gave that impression." He watched her for another moment, then walked back to his table. Maeve turned around. The galley was empty except for her. She put both hands flat on the prep counter, pressed down until she could feel the wood grain through her palms, and breathed. She thought about the tobacco tin under the floorboard. She thought about Delia's shoes, which were starting to wear through on the right heel. She thought about the paycheck at the end of next week, $7, which she'd been counting since Monday of last week. She thought about none of that, actually. She picked up a knife and went back to work. It was Harold who told her about the man at table 2. "He's been on the train 3 days, Harold said, coming through the galley door around noon with a stack of dirty plates. "Boarded in Flagstaff, same as us. He's going to Tucson." "Why are you telling me?" "Because he asked whether the cook might want to know that he thought the breakfast this morning was the best he'd eaten in 6 months. She stopped what she was doing. He said that. He said, and I am quoting here, "Tell the cook if you get a chance. I don't want her to think nobody noticed." Harold set the plates by the wash basin. "I thought you might want to know." She didn't say anything for a moment. It was such a small thing. It shouldn't have mattered the way it did. "What's his name?" she asked. "Mercer, Colt Mercer." Harold picked up the next stack of plates. "He ranches somewhere outside Tucson, I think. Asked me about the line schedules, whether we run on Sundays." She went back to her prep work. "That's nice of him," she said. "To say that." "I thought so," Harold agreed, and let it alone. She didn't speak to Colt Mercer that day. She saw him again at the window. He came for lunch, ordered the beef stew, ate it without complaint, and left a clean plate. But he was at the far end of the car, and she was in the kitchen, and there was no particular reason for their paths to cross. She thought about Harold's words more than she should have. "I don't want her to think nobody noticed." It was a strange thing to say to a stranger through a train steward, not the kind of compliment people usually offered, the casual, performative kind, the kind that cost nothing because it wasn't really addressed to anyone in particular. This one had been addressed to her, specifically through a third party, which was the awkward and deliberate effort of someone who had something to say and wasn't sure of the proper channel. She didn't know what to do with that. She filed it away with the things she didn't know what to do with, which was a category that had been growing for some time, and went back to work. Delia woke up at noon and came into the kitchen with flour on her cheek from sleeping against a sack of it, her dark hair in a braid that had mostly come loose, rubbing her eyes with the back of her wrist. "I'm hungry," she announced. "There's biscuits from this morning, bottom shelf." Delia found them, pulled one apart, examined it. "They're hard. They've been sitting 3 hours. Can I have butter?" "Small amount." Delia got the butter crock from the icebox, applied more than a small amount, and settled onto the stool in the corner that was officially a step stool and unofficially Delia's seat. She ate the biscuit in 3 bites. "What are we doing tonight?" she asked. "Same as every night. I finish service, we get off in Flagstaff, we go home. Can we go to the river?" The river, the Rio Salado tributary that ran along the south side of Flagstaff, was Delia's preferred location for everything. She'd gone there to read, to think, to sit and throw stones and conduct whatever interior life a 12-year-old conducted. "Maybe," Maeve said, "if I'm not too tired." "You're always tired." "I know." Delia pulled at a loose thread on the hem of her dress. "Maeve." "What? Do you think we'll always be doing this?" Maeve was trimming the fat off a cut of beef. She kept her eyes on the knife. "Doing what?" "This. The train. Flagstaff. The room." "Not forever," Maeve said. "But how long?" She set the knife down, looked at her sister who was looking back at her with the kind of steady, uncomfortable directness that 12-year-olds were capable of when they'd decided they wanted a real answer. "I don't know," Maeve said. "Long enough. Until something changes." "What changes it?" "I don't know that either." Delia considered this. "That's not very reassuring." "No," Maeve agreed. "It's not." Delia finished her biscuit, got another one, applied more butter. "I heard one of the passengers talking," she said through a mouthful. "Through the wall. He said you were the best cook on the line." "Who said that?" "I don't know. A man. He had a quiet voice." Delia swallowed. "He was talking to the steward. He didn't know I could hear through the wall." Maeve went back to the beef. "The walls are thin." "He was very specific about it. He said the biscuits were different from the ones he'd had before, that someone had put care into them." Delia paused. "I thought that was nice. Most people just eat." "Most people just eat," Maeve agreed. "It's nice when someone notices." Maeve didn't answer that. She focused on the knife, the meat, the work in front of her, and let the moment pass the way she let most moments pass, without holding on to it, without giving it weight it might use to pull at something inside her she couldn't afford to have pulled at. The afternoon service was lighter. A few passengers wanted coffee, 2 wanted late lunches she'd have to stretch the morning's leftovers to cover, 1 wanted pie. She'd made 2 apple pies at 4 a.m. and 1 was still intact in the pie safe, and otherwise the car was quiet. The desert outside the windows had shifted from the burned gold of morning to something deeper and more complicated as the sun moved, shadow gathering in the arroyos, the scrub brush going dark at its roots. She was washing up when Harold knocked on the galley door. "Mercer's asked if he can speak with the cook," he said. She looked up. Her hands were in the wash basin. "Why?" "He didn't say. He was very polite about it. He said he didn't want to trouble you, and if you were busy, he understood completely." She dried her hands on her apron. "Fine." She came out to the dining car. She rarely did this, left the kitchen during service hours, and the few passengers still present looked up with the mild curiosity of people who'd been watching the same stretch of desert for 6 hours and were ready for any new development. He was at table 2, same as before. Up close, he was a little older than she'd thought, closer to 30 than 25, with lines around his eyes from squinting into sun and wind. He stood when she came to the table, which she hadn't expected, and she made herself not react to it. "Miss Holloway," he said. "Mr. Mercer, I appreciate you coming out. I know you're busy." He gestured to the seat across from him and then seemed to realize he was inviting her to sit at her own workplace and stopped gesturing. "I just wanted to say, The food on this line has been, well, I've been riding railroads for a while, and I don't usually. He stopped, started again. The biscuits this morning, they were good. I don't mean good the way people say it to be polite. They were genuinely good, and I wanted to say so directly. She studied him for a moment. He was not performing this. She'd been in food service long enough to know the difference between a person who offered compliments as social currency and a person who'd had something to say and worked themselves up to saying it. This was the second kind. Thank you, she said. I appreciate that. I also... He stopped again. He was not entirely comfortable with this conversation, she realized. He'd asked to have it, but that didn't mean it was easy for him. I witnessed what happened this morning, with the man in the wool suit. She went still. I wasn't trying to watch, he said. The service window is right there, and I was at the nearest table, and I... He shook his head. What he said to you was unkind. The way he spoke to you was unkind, and you handled it with more patience than most people would have, and I thought... Another stop. I thought somebody should say something about it, since nobody did. Maeve looked at him for a long moment. The train swayed gently on the tracks. Outside, the desert was going amber in the late afternoon light. That man is a paying passenger, she said carefully. I know. And I'm a railroad cook. I know that too. So what I do is keep my head down and do my job. That's probably the right call, he said. I'm not saying it isn't. I'm just saying that someone should have noticed, and apparently nobody did except me, and I thought, I don't know. It seemed worth noting. She looked at him a moment longer. His hat was on the table again, same as this morning. He met her eyes without looking away, but there was nothing aggressive in it. He just looked at her the way you looked at someone when you were telling them something you meant. It's noted, she said. Thank you. She went back to the kitchen. She thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. Not because it was remarkable, exactly. People said kind things occasionally. She wasn't so worn down that she'd forgotten that, but because of the specific quality of it. He hadn't said you poor thing, or you should quit if they treat you like that, or any of the things that would have landed with pity. He'd said someone should have noticed, as if the noticing itself was the thing that mattered, as if the failure had been in the looking rather than in her. She wasn't sure why that distinction felt as significant as it did. She was fairly sure she should stop thinking about it. She didn't entirely stop thinking about it. What? At 4:30, Fenwick came back to the window. She saw him before he knocked, his shape in the service window, that particular set of his shoulders, and she had approximately 2 seconds to compose herself. Good afternoon, she said. He didn't bother with pleasantries. The pie I was served after lunch. My wife and I were expecting something made from fresh fruit. What we received was clearly from a tin. The apples were from a tin. She had 2 of those tins left in the supply closet. There were no fresh apples on the train because fresh apples did not survive well in an Arizona summer, which was something she had not invented and could not change. I apologize for the disappointment, she said. I'm not asking for an apology. I'm asking for an explanation of why I'm paying full passenger fare and receiving canned goods. The line doesn't carry fresh fruit in summer months. I should have noted that when Harold took your order. That's an oversight on our part. It is, he agreed. And? She looked at him. And I'll be sure the steward notes it going forward. I'd like a refund for the pie. I'll need to speak with Mr. Briggs about that. It's above my authority. Then get him. She held the edge of the window frame, let go of it. One moment. She went to find Harold. Harold was in the storage corridor, making notes in his ledger. She explained the situation in a sentence and a half. He listened, then closed his ledger. I'll go speak with Mr. Fenwick, he said. He wants a refund for the pie. I'll handle it. She went back to the galley. Through the partition wall, she could hear Harold's voice, low and professionally even, and then Fenwick's voice, and then a longer silence. She didn't hear the rest of it. She went back to work. 15 minutes later, Harold came back through the galley door. Settled, he said. Did you refund the pie? I offered him a complimentary dinner, and he accepted that instead. Harold looked at her. He's not a pleasant man, Maeve. No. You don't have to take everything he says as if it's accurate. I know. His eggs were not cold. I know because I was standing right there when you plated them. She looked at Harold. He was 40-something, gray at the temples, had been on this railroad for more years than she'd been alive. He'd never in 11 months said anything to her that was purely sympathetic. This was as close as he got. "I know," she said again, and went back to work. Yeah. The train pulled into Flagstaff at 7:40 in the evening, which was 20 minutes late because of a slow stretch of track near Williams that always ran slow. Maeve had finished the dinner service, scrubbed the galley, inventoried the supply closet, and was standing on the platform with Delia beside her and a headache beginning at the base of her skull. The platform at Flagstaff was bright with lanterns, busy with people, some getting on, some getting off, some just watching the way people watch trains because trains were still a spectacle in 1883, still something that could stop you in your tracks simply by existing at that size and that noise and that speed. Delia was looking at something. "That's him," she whispered. "Who?" "The quiet man, the one whose voice I heard through the wall." Maeve followed her sister's gaze. Colt Mercer was standing near the far end of the platform, his travel bag on the ground beside him, apparently waiting for someone or waiting to orient himself to the station. He'd put his hat on. He looked, she thought, like someone who was used to arriving in places and figuring out where he was going next. He hadn't gotten off in Tucson. Flagstaff was the last stop before looping back. She'd assumed. He looked up, apparently by coincidence, and his eyes found her across the platform. He lifted his hand in a brief acknowledgement, not quite a wave, just a recognition. She nodded back. He picked up his bag and walked in the direction of the station building. "Do you know him?" Delia asked. "He was on the train today." "Is he nice?" "He seemed to be." Delia considered this. "You should find out," she said, in the philosophical tone she sometimes deployed without understanding the implications. "Not many people are actually nice. You should know which ones are." Maeve put her hand briefly on Delia's shoulder. "Come on, let's go home." They walked off the platform into the warm evening, the desert night settling around Flagstaff with its particular quality of darkness. Not oppressive, just enormous, stretching in every direction until the stars began. Maeve walked with her hands in her apron pockets, her head aching, her feet already dreading tomorrow's 4 a.m. start, and thought about none of it particularly. She thought instead, briefly and against her own judgment, about a man who'd said that someone should have noticed, and who had the quiet but specific courage to be that someone. It was a small thing. She told herself it was a small thing. By the time they got back to the room on Elm Street with the tobacco tin under the floorboard and the single window that looked out onto an alley, she had mostly convinced herself she'd put it down properly. She lay awake longer than she should have. The headache faded. The room was quiet except for Delia's breathing and the distant sound of a dog somewhere in the neighborhood. Tomorrow was Tuesday. She'd be on the train at 3. She'd have the range going by 3:30. She'd make biscuits again. She made biscuits every morning because they could be done quickly and they held. And if you made them right, they were genuinely good, and she knew how to make them right. She wasn't thinking about anything else. She told herself that clearly. She went to sleep. The note appeared on Wednesday. She'd been on the line 2 more days since Flagstaff, making the run east to Winslow and back. Different passengers, different complaints, the same desert going past the same window. She'd stopped thinking about the incident with Fenwick. He'd gotten off in Tucson, which meant she'd never see him again, which was a thought she had calmly and without emotion. She'd thought less about Colt Mercer than she'd have expected, or told herself she had, which was not quite the same thing. Wednesday's train boarded at Flagstaff at 6 a.m., heading south toward Tucson. She'd been in the galley since 3:30. The biscuits were in the oven. The coffee urn was going. She was beating eggs for the scramble when Harold came through the door. "Someone left this," he said, and set a folded piece of paper on the prep counter. She looked at it. Her name was written on the outside, Miss Holloway, in plain, careful handwriting that did not belong to anyone she recognized. "Who left it?" she asked. "A man boarded this morning, quiet, ranching sort, dark hair." Harold paused. "He ordered coffee and biscuits and asked if I'd pass that along to the cook." She looked at the paper. She did not pick it up immediately. She went back to the eggs, got them where she wanted them, set them aside, and then picked up the note. It said, "Miss Holloway, I know I'm a stranger and you have no reason to take this to heart, but I think you should know that what you do matters more than people on this train realize. I've eaten at restaurants that charge 10 times what a railroad ticket costs, and not once did any of it taste like someone actually gave a damn about it. Yours does. I don't know what you've got riding on this job or what it costs you to show up every morning, but whatever it is, it's worth something. You're worth something. I just thought you should hear it from someone besides yourself. See. Mercer Maeve read it twice. Then she folded it back along its creases and set it in her apron pocket. The biscuits smelled right. She took them out of the oven, tapped the tops to check the crust, and began plating. Through the service window, table 2 was occupied by a man in trail clothes with his hat on the table and a cup of coffee in his hand and his eyes on the desert going past outside. She did not look at him. She focused on the biscuits, on the plates, on the work, but she did not take the note out of her pocket and leave it behind when the shift ended. She carried it all the way back to Flagstaff, and when she got home, she put it in the tobacco tin under the floorboard next to the $1 she'd been saving. She told herself it was just something to keep, just a record of a small and decent thing. She went to bed early. She had to be up at 3. He came back the following Sunday. Maeve knew it before she saw him. Or rather, she heard Harold's particular footstep in the galley doorway, the one that meant he had something to tell her that he wasn't sure how to frame. And when she turned around, he was standing there with his order book open and an expression of careful neutrality. "Table 2, he said. She looked through the service window. Colt Mercer was sitting in the same seat he'd occupied the Wednesday before, hat on the table, coffee not yet arrived. He was looking out the window at the Flagstaff platform as the last passengers boarded, and there was something about the angle of his shoulders, not tense, just settled, that suggested a man who had specifically decided to be somewhere and was at peace with that decision. "What does he want?" she asked. "Coffee and whatever's good this morning?" Harold paused. His words, "Whatever's good." She turned back to the range. "Biscuits are good. Scrambled eggs, bacon if he wants it." "I'll tell him." Harold left. She kept her eyes on the pan in front of her, on the eggs just beginning to set at the edges, on the heat she needed to manage and the timing she needed to hold. She did not look through the service window again for a full 10 minutes, which was a choice she was aware she was making. When she finally did look, he was reading the same kind of folded pages she'd seen before. Letters, or something like them. He read them with a stillness that most people didn't have on trains, where the motion and the noise produced a low-grade restlessness in almost everyone. He just sat there, reading, as if the train were standing still, and the desert weren't moving past at 30 miles an hour, and the world had agreed to wait. She passed his plate through the window when it was ready. He looked up, and she was already turning away. She heard him say to Harold, "Tell her the biscuits are the best thing I've eaten on a railroad in 8 years. She heard Harold relay this through the partition not 2 minutes later, unnecessarily, since she'd been close enough to hear it directly. "I heard him," she said. "I know," Harold said. "I just thought you might want me to say it officially." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Go take the Hendersons their coffee." He went. He boarded again the following Wednesday, and the Sunday after that. By the 3rd visit, Harold had stopped making an event of it. By the 4th, she'd stopped pretending she hadn't noticed the pattern. Colt Mercer was riding the Flagstaff to Tucson line on a schedule that had no obvious logistical justification. A man with a ranch outside Tucson did not need to be in Flagstaff twice a week on a consistent basis, not for any ranching reason she could think of. And he sat at table 2 and ordered quietly and ate without complaint and left a clean plate every time. He did not come to the service window. He did not send another note. He didn't do anything that required her to respond or react or address the situation directly, which she suspected was deliberate, because it was exactly what she would have done in his position if she were trying not to push someone who had good reason to be guarded. She wasn't sure whether that was reassuring or unsettling. She settled on something in between. It was Delia who finally named it. The way Delia named things Maeve was carefully not naming. They were walking home from the station on a Wednesday evening, the late July heat still sitting heavy even after sundown, when Delia said, "He was on the train again." "I know. That's the 4th time." "5th." Delia looked at her. "You've been counting." "I've noticed a pattern. That's different from counting." "Is it?" "Delia. I'm just saying, don't." Delia was quiet for half a block, then, "He doesn't eat anywhere else on the train, just your food." "He's in the dining car, that's where the food is." "You know what I mean." She did know what Delia meant. She kept walking. He seems like a decent person, Delia said, in the tone of someone making a purely factual observation. From what I can tell through the wall. You're listening through the wall again. The wall is thin. I can't unhear things. Delia pulled her loose braid over one shoulder. He talks to Harold sometimes, when it's quiet. He asked how long you'd been on the line. Maeve stopped walking. Delia stopped a half step later and turned to look at her. He wasn't being strange about it. He just asked. What did Harold say? About a year, and the man said, Delia thought about it. He said, she's good at it. She must work hard. And Harold said, you have no idea. And that was it. Maeve stood there on the dirt sidewalk in the dark with the sound of someone's screen door banging somewhere down the street and thought about Harold saying you have no idea and the specific weariness that probably lived in those 3 words. Come on, she said. They went home. The first real conversation happened by accident, the way most real things happened. It was a Thursday, second week of August, and the train was running slow because of heat on the rails. The kind of heat that made the metal expand and forced the engineer to drop speed or risk a warped track. They were an hour behind schedule by noon, which meant the passengers who had connections in Tucson were anxious, which meant they came to the window more often, which meant Maeve had been fielding complaints since 10 a.m. While simultaneously running the lunch service short-handed because the boy who sometimes helped with dishes had gotten off at Winslow sick. She was doing 3 things at once: stirring the soup pot, watching the rolls in the oven, and washing up the breakfast dishes herself because they weren't going to wash themselves. When the galley door opened, she turned, expecting Harold. It was Colt Mercer. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and the particular look of a man who had just done something he'd been debating for a while. Harold asked me to... There's a stack of plates, he said, at the end of the car. He said you were short a hand and asked if I'd bring them through. She looked at the plates he was carrying, then at him. Harold asked you to do that. He seemed pretty confident you'd need them. She took the plates from him, set them on the counter. Thank you. You can go back to... I can wash, he said. She looked at him again. Dishes, he clarified. I can wash dishes. I've done it before. I'm not going to pretend I'm good at it, but I can get the job done. She should have said no. It was against railroad policy, passengers in the service areas. And beyond that, it was unusual in a way she didn't entirely know how to categorize. A stranger offering to wash her dishes, and she was already off balance from the slow train and the short staff and the long morning. The basin's there, she said. Water's in the pitcher. Don't use too much. I need some left for the afternoon. He rolled up his sleeves. He was not, as he'd said, particularly skilled. He was slow and deliberate and missed a few spots she'd have gotten in a single pass. But he worked without being asked to keep going, and he didn't talk, which she appreciated more than she could have said. After about 10 minutes, the rolls needed to come out. She opened the oven, checked them, pulled the pan. The smell of them hit the small space, yeasty, browned, real, and she heard him exhale. God, he said quietly, as if he hadn't meant to say it out loud. Don't get excited, she said. They're for the lunch service. I know. A pause. I'm not going to pretend I didn't come to the dining car for lunch, though. She set the pan on the cooling rack. How many times have you ridden this line? He was quiet for a moment. 6. In 6 weeks, give or take, or... She turned around. He was standing at the wash basin, his hands in the water, and he met her eyes with the straightforward quality she'd noticed the first time. Not aggressive, not performing, just meeting her gaze because that was the honest thing to do. The ranch isn't keeping you busy enough? She asked. The ranch is fine. Then why? You know why, he said. Simple as that. Not pushing it, not making a production of it, just putting it down between them where they could both see it. She looked at him. Outside, the desert was bleached white in the noon light, nearly colorless. The train ran slow and steady. Mr. Mercer, she said carefully. Colt. I don't have time for... I'm not asking you for time, he said. I'm washing your dishes. She looked at the dishes. She looked at him. She picked up the roll pan and carried it to the window ledge. The soup's beef barley, she said. It'll be ready in 20 minutes. All right. If you're going to eat lunch, you should eat at the table, not in my kitchen. Fair enough? He dried his hands on the cloth she offered him, picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the corner of the counter, and went back out to the dining car. She stood in the galley alone and pressed her hands against the counter. The soup bubbled. The rolls cooled. The train rocked gently south. She was not going to make something out of nothing. She was not going to let a small kindness expand into something larger than it was. She had been doing fine for 11 months, and she was going to keep doing fine. She served the lunch rush and did not think about it until it was over, which took about an hour, and then she thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. He came back through the galley door at 1:30 with a stack of lunch plates, which Harold had clearly not sent him for, since Harold could carry his own plates, and always had. "Harold didn't ask you," she said, not looking up. "No." He set them down. "But you're still short a hand." She straightened. "I appreciate the help, but passengers shouldn't be in the kitchen." "I know, I figured you might make an exception for someone who's useful." "That's a bold assumption." "It is," he agreed. He didn't apologize for it. She looked at him, properly this time, without the service window between them and without the morning rush as an excuse to look away. He was standing in the middle of her galley, looking like a man who had learned to be patient the hard way, not born that way, but arrived at it through whatever years had shaped him. The lines around his eyes were from outside work, and his hands were a working man's hands, but there was nothing rough in the way he held himself. "Where are you actually from?" she asked. "You said a ranch outside Tucson." "My family's got land there. My father started it. He died 4 years ago, and I've been running it since." He paused. "There are 3 of us, me and my 2 brothers. We work it together mostly. I took the trail up to the Navajo Range this spring, cattle drive, 6 months, got back in July, and then started riding this train." She crossed her arms. "What are you doing in Flagstaff?" "Visiting a supplier I don't actually need to visit that often." A pause. "I'm aware that's not a convincing reason." She huffed. Not a laugh exactly, but something with a similar shape. "Mr. Mercer, Colt. You're going to ride this line for how long?" He thought about it with what appeared to be genuine consideration. "I haven't worked that out," he admitted. "That's not a plan." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She shook her head. She wasn't angry. That was the problem. She couldn't find the anger she'd have expected herself to feel, the instinctive resistance. She found instead a kind of baffled recognition, as if she was looking at something that wasn't quite what she'd thought it was going to be. "I have work to do," she said. "I know. I'll go." He went. She stood there for a moment after the door shut, her hands loose at her sides, and then she went back to work. But she was aware, uncomfortably, persistently aware, of the fact that she did not find his presence in her kitchen as aggravating as it should have been. She told no one about this, not Harold, who would have been professionally neutral about it in a way she'd have found maddening, not Delia, who would have immediately started attaching meaning to things that didn't need meaning attached. She kept it to herself, the same way she kept most things to herself, and watched it carefully the way you watched something you weren't sure about, not dismissing it, not feeding it, just watching. Over the next 2 weeks, a pattern developed that neither of them had designed. He wrote on Wednesdays and Sundays. He ordered whatever she'd made that morning, ate it at table 2, and somewhere in the mid-morning, when the breakfast rush had thinned and the dining car was quieter, he'd appear at the service window, not demanding anything. Sometimes he had a question. "What's in the soup today?" Whether the pie was apple or something else. Small excuses for a few sentences back and forth. She answered briefly. She didn't extend the conversations, but she stopped cutting them short before they'd properly started, which was its own kind of extension. He learned in that slow way that she was from Kansas, that she'd been in Arizona going on 2 years, that Delia was her sister and not her daughter, which seemed to be an assumption he'd made early on and quietly corrected without mentioning, that she'd learned to cook from her mother, who had been a practical woman with no particular interest in recipes, but an instinct for flavor that couldn't really be taught. She learned, through the same incremental means, that he'd grown up doing ranch work but had wanted, briefly, to study law. That he'd given it up not because he was forced to, but because his father's health had declined and someone needed to stay, and he was the oldest and that was simply how it fell. That he didn't resent it exactly, but kept the abandoned possibility the way you kept a coat that no longer fit, in the back, not thinking about it much, knowing it was there. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked, one Wednesday in late August through the service window. She'd asked without planning to, and was mildly annoyed at herself for it. He considered. "Sometimes. Mostly, I miss the idea of it. I was 19 when I thought about it. I don't know that I'd have been any good at it." "You might have been." "I might have been." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "You ever want something different than this?" She looked at him through the window. It was the kind of question that could be intrusive, but it wasn't, coming from him. He wasn't asking with any edge of judgment. He asked the way someone asked when they were genuinely curious and weren't going to use the answer against you. "Every day," she said. "What would it look like?" She thought about it. "A kitchen that doesn't move," she said finally. "I'm good at this, but I'd be better somewhere I could actually stock what I need and plan a week's worth of meals instead of improvising every morning." She paused. "Somewhere Delia could go to school properly." "She's not in school?" "Not regular. There's a woman in Flagstaff who tutors her twice a week. That's what I can afford right now." He was quiet for a moment. "She seems smart. Your sister." "She is. Smarter than me, probably. She just hasn't had the opportunity yet." "Yet," he said. "Yet," she repeated, and the words sat there between them with a specific weight. Not heavy, exactly, but present. She moved away from the window because the coffee urn needed refilling, and by the time she came back he'd returned to his table and the conversation had ended the way their conversations ended, without fanfare, just a natural stop. But she found herself thinking for the rest of the afternoon about the word "yet" and how it had sounded when she said it. Like a door she hadn't known was still open. Tit. The trouble came on a Sunday in the last week of August. She should have seen it coming. She knew the type. But the train had been full that morning, a holiday crowd, and she'd been running flat out since 3 a.m., and by 10 o'clock she was running on pure function. The man's name was Preston, and he came to the service window with his wife at his elbow and the specific self-assurance of someone who had never had to calculate what anything cost. He was maybe 45, ruddy and broad, with the voice of a man accustomed to filling rooms. "I want to understand," he said, setting his plate on the window ledge with a sound that was just barely not a slam. What exactly was supposed to be wrong with that? She looked at the plate. The food was there, mostly untouched. "Is there a problem?" "There is. The eggs were rubbery and the biscuit was— I don't know what happened to that biscuit, but it was not right." She had been making biscuits since before this man was awake, and she knew exactly what had happened to that biscuit, which was nothing. The biscuits were correct. She'd made 60 of them, and they were all correct. "I apologize," she said. "I can remake—" "I don't want to remake. I want to understand how a dining car on a major rail line can serve breakfast that a hotel would throw out." He was talking at a volume that was carrying. The dining car was not empty. "My wife didn't finish hers either." His wife, who had not said a word, looked at the middle distance with the expression of someone who had learned to not be in the room when this happened. "I understand your disappointment," Maeve said, keeping her voice flat. "I can offer— I'll tell you what I'd like. I'd like a proper explanation, and then I'd like to know who to write to about this, because I travel this line regularly, and I have never, in 4 years of travel, had a breakfast this poor." He was lying about that, or misremembering, or simply performing. It didn't matter which. The people at nearby tables had gone quiet in the specific way people went quiet when something was happening that they couldn't look away from. Maeve held the window frame. She thought about the tobacco tin. She thought about the dollars she'd been saving. She thought about Delia's shoes. "I'll get the steward," she said. "I don't want the steward. I want the person responsible." "That's me, sir." "Then I'm speaking to you." "You are. And what do you have to say for yourself?" Everything she thought of saying would have cost her the job. She ran through them fast, a whole column of true things she would not say, and settled on, "I'm sorry the breakfast didn't meet your expectations. It won't happen again." "It won't," he said, "because I'll be writing a letter to the line management tonight." "That's your right." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was looking for something to push against and wasn't finding it. Then he picked up the plate and went back to his table. Maeve turned around. The galley was quiet. She stood with her back to the window and breathed twice, slowly, deliberately. She heard footsteps in the dining car, more than one person moving, and then heard a voice she recognized now without needing to see the face. "I don't know what train you've been riding," Colt said, "but that was the best biscuit I've eaten in 6 months, and I've been eating here every week, so if you've got a complaint about the cook, I'd be real interested to hear what you think she did wrong." She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. There was silence from Preston's table. "You got rubbery eggs," Colt continued, and his voice was not loud and not aggressive, just even and plainly certain. "When the train's been rocking on these tracks for 3 hours, I'd like to know what you expected." "Excuse me," Preston said. "I wasn't speaking to you." "No, you were speaking at someone who can't talk back without losing her job. So I'm talking back instead." Another silence. Longer. "Mind your own business," Preston said finally, in a voice that had lost most of its volume. "I'm minding everybody's breakfast," Colt said, "since we're all sitting in the same car." She heard Preston mutter something to his wife. She heard his chair scrape. She heard nothing more from that table for the remainder of the trip. She stood in the galley with her hand still pressed against her mouth and her eyes doing something inconvenient, and then she breathed in, breathed out, put both hands on the prep counter, and made herself straighten up. She was not going to cry in her kitchen. She was not. She went back to the range and checked the soup. Harold came to the door 20 minutes later with the look of a man who had been watching a situation and making choices about when to get involved. "You all right?" he asked. "Fine." "Mercer caused a bit of a stir out there." "I heard." "Preston's complaining, not about the food this time, about Mercer." She kept her eyes on the soup. "Is he going to write a letter about that too?" Harold made a sound. "Probably." A pause. For what it's worth, the people at the tables around them looked relieved. Someone saying something, I mean. "I didn't ask him to say anything." "I know that." "He shouldn't have." Harold was quiet for a moment, then, carefully, "Maybe not. But he did. And I'm not sure Preston would have stopped if someone hadn't pushed back." He paused. "That's all I'm saying." He left. She stood at the range and thought about Colt's voice. That specific quality of evenness, the way he'd said so, I'm talking back instead, with no heat in it, but no yield either. She'd met men who defended women as a performance, as a way of looking good or feeling important. That was not what that had been. That had been someone who had seen something wrong and addressed it with the same practical directness he applied to everything else, because it was simply what the situation required. She thought about that for a long time. At the window, shortly before the train reached Tucson, he appeared. Not with a question or an order. The service was effectively over for the runs. Just standing there. She came to the window. "You didn't need to do that," she said. "I know. I had it handled." "You did," he said. "You always do." A pause. "That wasn't the point." She looked at him. "What was the point?" He thought about it for a moment, genuinely, as if he was working out how to say a real thing accurately. "Someone should be on your side sometimes," he said. "That's all. Not because you can't manage, you clearly can, just because you shouldn't always have to manage alone." She didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't sure what she would have done with an answer, even if she'd had one. The window was between them, and the train was slowing into Tucson, and there were other things she needed to be doing. "Thank you," she said. It came out less formal than she'd intended. He nodded once and went to collect his hat. She thought about what he'd said the whole train ride back to Flagstaff. You shouldn't always have to manage alone. It was such a simple thing to say. It was the kind of thing that was easy to say and harder to mean, and she was experienced enough in the world to know the difference. She'd known people who said the right things and meant nothing by them, and she'd known people who said very little and meant all of it. She didn't want to put him in a category. She was aware she was putting him in a category anyway. Delia, who had heard the confrontation through the wall, was very quiet on the walk home. This meant she was thinking hard about something, which Maeve had learned to be wary of. They were halfway home when Delia said, "He didn't do it to show off." "I know." "Some men do that, defend a woman to show off." "I know." "He didn't sound like that. He just sounded—" Delia paused, searching. "Like someone who'd had enough." "He's not involved in my problems," Maeve said. "He seems to think he might be." "Delia, I'm just saying what I heard. What you heard through a wall. The wall is thin," Delia said without apology. Maeve kept walking. The evening was warm, the sky that deep darkening blue it went at dusk in Arizona, and the dust on the road was pale and fine and stirred around their boots as they walked. She thought about thin walls. She thought about how much had passed through them over the past few weeks. Not just sound, but something less easy to name. Some steady accumulating thing that she hadn't made a decision about and wasn't sure yet whether she was going to. She had built a life out of not needing things she couldn't afford. She'd gotten very good at it. She'd built the walls herself, and she knew exactly where each one stood. She thought about a man who had stood in her galley washing dishes he hadn't been asked to wash, who had carried plates he hadn't been asked to carry, who had eaten her food with genuine attention and said so without expecting anything back, who had just spent 20 minutes on a train defending her to a stranger at some personal cost because it was simply what the situation required. She thought about all of it. She didn't say anything for the rest of the walk, but she went to sleep that night without the usual cold tallying she did at the end of every day. The dollars, the days, the running count of how far they still were from something better, and instead just lay in the dark listening to the town settle into night and thought about a word she'd said out loud weeks ago. Yet. She was still thinking about it when she fell asleep. September came in like a furnace door left open. The temperature across the Arizona territory climbed past anything reasonable and stayed there. The kind of sustained heat that stopped being dramatic after the first week and became simply a condition of existence, something you moved through and worked inside and tried not to think about directly because thinking about it made it worse. The desert went bleached and silent in the middle of the day. Even the scrub brush looked exhausted. On the train it was worse. The cars collected heat the way cast iron did, slowly, completely, refusing to give it back. Passengers fanned themselves with whatever they had. The windows were open, but the wind they pulled in was hot. And by mid-morning, the dining car felt like the inside of a bread oven and smelled like coffee and sweat and the particular staleness of enclosed air that had been breathed by too many people for too many hours. In the galley, Maeve stopped noticing it. She'd learned to stop noticing it, the way you learn to stop noticing the motion of the train or the constant sound of the wheels. You folded it into the background and functioned through it because you didn't have the option of not functioning. She kept the wet rag in her apron pocket. She moved efficiently, without waste, conserving herself the way water was conserved in the desert. Every drop counted. Nothing was squandered. She was sleeping badly. She didn't tell anyone this. The heat in their room on Elm Street was bad at night, and even when it wasn't the heat, there was a low-grade alertness that had been running through her for the past several weeks that she hadn't entirely identified or addressed. She lay awake and counted things: the dollar in the tobacco tin, the days until the next paycheck, the cost of Delia's upcoming school supplies, and told herself she was being practical, which was true, but which was not the only thing happening. She thought about Colt Mercer more than she should have. She'd accepted that. She'd stopped pretending it wasn't happening and moved on to simply not acting on it, which felt like the more achievable goal. He'd been on the train 5 times since the incident with Preston. Each time the pattern held. He sat at table 2, he ordered whatever was made. He appeared at the window during the slow stretch of morning when the car was quieter. Their conversations had grown longer without her quite tracking how. She'd told him things she hadn't planned to tell him, about her mother, about Kansas, about the specific exhaustion of being the person in charge since 19. He listened without performing listening, which was rarer than it should have been. He didn't try to fix things or suggest alternatives or tell her what he'd have done differently. He just listened, and then, sometimes, said something true back. She was aware that she was in some danger of relying on this. She was being very careful about it. The 1st of September fell on a Wednesday. She'd been on shift since 3. By 8 in the morning, the breakfast rush was at its worst. A full car, a holiday crowd, somebody's family reunion taking up 4 tables and ordering separately and changing their minds twice. And she was cooking flat out with the range at full heat in a galley that was already pushing 100 degrees. The rag in her pocket wasn't keeping up. She'd been using it every few minutes, face, wrists, back of the neck, and it was dry within seconds each time. She stopped noticing that too and kept moving because the orders were stacking up, and there was no version of this morning where she stopped. By 9:30, the rush had thinned but not ended. She was still standing, still cooking, still moving. Harold had been in and out 3 times with dirty plates and new orders. Delia was in the supply closet. Maeve had checked on her at 7 and found her reading, which was normal, which was fine. At 10, she felt it. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the sudden blackout of novels. It was quieter and more insidious than that. A slow narrowing of the edges of her vision, a strange displacement, as if the floor were not quite as solid as it had been. She put her hand on the prep counter. The world adjusted slightly. The brightness behind her eyes that she knew and watched for was there, more present than usual. She turned down the range. She reached for the rag. She pressed it against the back of her neck and held it there and breathed. The door opened. She expected Harold. It was not Harold. Colt came through the galley door with his hat already off, which meant he'd been moving quickly and hadn't taken the time, and he looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on his face before, a focused, unambiguous concern that didn't bother to arrange itself into something less obvious. "You need to sit down," he said. "I'm fine." "You're not. You're gray." "It's the heat." "I know it's the heat. Sit down." She started to say something that would have been a refusal, but her body did something inconvenient in that moment. A slow, heavy sway that she felt from the inside and apparently wasn't invisible from the outside, because he crossed the galley in 3 steps and got his hand under her elbow. "I have orders up," she said. "They can wait 2 minutes." "They can't. I've got... Harold needs..." Harold can manage the dining car for 2 minutes. He moved her, not forcefully, but with a certainty she didn't have enough resistance for, toward the step stool in the corner. Delia's stool. And she sat down on it because her legs were making the decision before her head could override them. He crouched in front of her. "Put your head down." "I'm not going to faint." "You might." "I won't." She put her elbows on her knees and her face in her hands anyway, because the floor was still doing that thing, and the position helped. "I'm fine. I've been fine all morning." "What time did you start?" 3. He was quiet for a moment. "Have you eaten?" She didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. "Maeve, I was going to eat after the rush. It's 10 o'clock. I know what time it is. You've been cooking for 7 hours without eating anything. I've done it before." He stood up and went to the shelf. She heard him moving things around. The bread box, the tin of leftover biscuits from the morning, the butter crock from the ice box, and then he was crouching in front of her again with a biscuit and a cup of water. "Eat this," he said. She looked at the biscuit. She looked at him. Her pride was still there. She could feel it, a tight knot in the center of her chest. But her hands were not entirely steady when she took it, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that was telling. She ate the biscuit. She drank the water. He didn't say anything while she did. The floor leveled out. The edges of her vision came back. She pressed the cup between her palms and breathed and felt the situation retreating from whatever edge it had been approaching. "Thank you," she said. "You should tell someone when you're close to that." "I wasn't close. You were closer than you knew." He looked at her directly, and there was something in it that was harder to deflect than his usual evenness. A kind of unmasked worry that he wasn't trying to minimize. "This heat is bad. You can't run yourself empty and expect to keep going. I don't have the option of not keeping going." "I know you don't." He paused. "I know." She looked at him. He was still crouched in front of her, at her level, his hat on the floor beside him. He looked like a man who had something else to say, and was deciding whether to say it. "What?" she said. He was quiet for another beat, then, "I want to help. I don't know how to say that without it sounding like pity, and it isn't pity. But I want to help, and I haven't been sure how to offer it in a way you'd accept." She looked at the empty cup in her hands. "You wash my dishes," she said. "That's not what I mean." "I know it's not." "I could..." He stopped, started over. "There are things I could do, practically, for you and Delia. And I'm not saying this because I think you can't handle your own situation, because it's clear that you can and you have been, for a long time, without help from anyone. I'm saying it because I'd like to, if you'd let me." She stood up, not quickly. She was careful about it, testing her legs. But she stood and put the cup on the shelf and turned to face him. "What kind of help?" she asked. Her voice was careful, controlled. "Money," he said. Straight out, not dressed up. I've got more than I need right now from the cattle drive. It's sitting in a Tucson bank. I could, a little of it to cover Delia's schooling or whatever you need most. It wouldn't be a loan. You wouldn't owe anything. Stop, she said. He stopped. She looked at him and felt the knot in her chest pull tighter and then tighter still. And she recognized it now. Recognized what it was. Not pride exactly, but something built out of pride and grief and all the years of managing alone, all the years of being the person who handled it, all the years of telling Delia yet and meaning it, but not knowing when it would arrive or how. I don't need your money, she said. Her voice came out harder than she'd intended. I know you don't need it. I'm offering it because you feel sorry for me. That's not... You see a tired woman who can barely get through the morning without falling over, and you feel sorry for her, and you want to fix it because that's what you do. Maeve. His voice was level. Stop, please. She stopped, not because he asked, but because her voice had gotten thicker than she'd intended, and she needed a second. He looked at her. Not with pity. She'd been looking for pity, and it wasn't there. What was there was harder to categorize. He looked like someone who was watching something he cared about and was trying to figure out how to hold it without tightening his grip. I don't feel sorry for you, he said. I feel something. It's not that. The galley was quiet. The train rocked. Outside, the desert spread in every direction, white and enormous. Then what is it? She asked. He picked his hat up off the floor. He turned it in his hands once, the way he did when he was thinking. I've been riding this train for 2 months, he said. I've got work at home that I'm managing from a distance, brothers who think I've lost my mind, and a supplier I've now visited 11 times for no good reason. He looked at her. I think you know what it is. She did know. That was the problem. I'm a railroad cook, she said. The words came out flat, and she meant them that way. Not as self-pity, but as information, as a parameter. I have a 12-year-old sister depending on me, and I can't afford to be wrong about anything. I'm not asking you to be wrong about anything. You're asking me to trust something I can't calculate. Yes, he said. I am. She turned away from him. She went back to the range. She turned the heat back up and checked the soup pot and put both hands on the edge of the counter and stood there. The orders are still up, she said. A pause. I know. You should go back to the dining car. He didn't move immediately. She could feel him behind her, not close, just present, and she kept her eyes on the range. I'm not going to push this, he said. I'm not going to crowd you. But I need you to hear one thing before I go, and I need to say it once, clearly, so we both know I said it. She didn't answer. She was listening. I'm not offering you money because I think you're poor. I'm not showing up on this train because I feel sorry for you. I'm doing it because in 29 years, I have never once met someone who puts the kind of care you put into everything you do. And I don't know what to do with that except show up and hope that eventually you'll believe I mean it. He stopped. That's all. She heard him move. The door opened. She turned around, but he was already back in the dining car, the door swinging shut behind him. And she stood there in the empty galley with the soup bubbling and the heat pressing down and something in her chest that was cracked open along a line she hadn't felt before. She stood there for a long time. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand, straightened up, and went back to work. Because there was nothing else to do. Dust. She thought about it all afternoon. She did her best work when she was thinking hard about something else. Her hands knew what they were doing well enough to run without her. And so the afternoon service was, if anything, better than usual. She made a decent apple cobbler out of the last tin of apples and the remnants of the morning's butter, which should not have been as good as it turned out, and was. And Harold mentioned it twice, which meant the passengers had mentioned it to him first. She thought about what Colt had said. She ran it back like a piece of evidence, looking for the places where it wasn't true, looking for the performance, the angle, the thing underneath that would make it safe to dismiss. She couldn't find it. The train reached Tucson in the early evening, running late again because the heat did things to the tracks, and she stood in the galley doing the end-of-service cleanup and heard the passengers disembarking and tried not to be aware of whether she heard his footsteps among them. She heard Harold. Then quiet. Colt appeared in the galley doorway. She hadn't expected this. She turned around. He was standing there with his hat on, ready to get off the train, And he looked at her with that quality of directness that she'd stopped being surprised by and started, she realized, looking forward to. I shouldn't have offered money, he said. That was wrong. I was trying to fix something that isn't the problem, and I knew it while I was saying it, and I said it anyway because I was scared I wasn't going to get another chance to say anything useful. He paused. I'm sorry for that. She looked at him. She thought about what it had cost him to come back and say that, to locate the exact wrong thing he'd done and name it plainly without hedging. That was not a thing many people could do. It startled me, she said, more honest than she'd intended. I know. I'm not accustomed to being offered things. I could tell. She looked down at her hands, which were still a little red from the morning's work. She thought about the year and a half she'd spent being careful, being correct, not wanting things she couldn't calculate the cost of. I don't know what to do with you, she said. That's all right. He turned his hat in his hands. I don't need you to know yet. I want you to know that what I said this morning about why I keep coming back, that was the true thing. The money was wrong, but the rest of it wasn't. He held her eyes. I see you, Maeve. Not the situation, not what you're managing. You. And that's why I'm standing here. Outside, someone on the platform called out. A vendor, a porter, someone doing the business of a train station. The sounds of Tucson coming in through the window. The ordinary sounds of a world that was not paying attention to this moment. She thought about fear. She'd been living inside it so long it had started to feel like a personality trait, something innate, something she'd been born with rather than built from grief and hard years, and the absolute necessity of not being wrong. She thought about a word she'd said to Delia weeks ago, standing in their rented room looking at shoes that were wearing through. Yet, she thought about doors. I'm not easy, she said. He didn't flinch. I didn't think you were. I'm not going to stop working. I'm not going to become something different. I don't want you to. I don't know how to do this. Letting someone... She stopped, tried again. I'm not good at letting people in. I noticed that, he said, with a very small, very careful thing that was not quite a smile. I've been working around it for 2 months. She made a sound, almost a laugh. Her chest ached with it. If I were to consider, she said. The word landed carefully. What would that look like to you? He thought about it. Genuinely, the way he thought about everything. Not performing consideration, but actually taking the question seriously. Exactly what it looks like now, he said. I show up, we talk, I eat your food and tell you it's the best thing I've had and mean it every time. Nothing you're not ready for. And if I'm never ready, then I'll have eaten a lot of very good biscuits, he said, and that's not nothing. She looked at him for a long moment. The train was quiet around them, the afternoon crowd all departed, just the creak and settle of a resting locomotive. The light through the galley window was going amber and long, the particular late afternoon desert light that made even ordinary things look considered. All right, she said. He waited. You can court me, she said, and the words felt strange in her mouth. Old-fashioned, deliberate, like she was signing something, properly, on the terms I set. All right, I'm not making any promises beyond that. I understand. And you stop with the money. That's not what this is. Already said I was sorry for that. I'm saying it's a condition. Agreed. He put his hat on. I should get off before the train starts back. You should. He moved toward the door and then stopped and looked back at her once. Maeve. What? Thank you for not sending me off entirely. She turned back to the range so he wouldn't see her face. Don't thank me yet, she said. I haven't decided if you're worth the trouble. She heard the door open and close behind him. She heard his footsteps on the platform outside. She stood with her hands on the counter and her face doing things she wasn't going to analyze and waited until the train began to move before she let herself exhale. Delia knew immediately. Maeve had not said a word. She'd come home from the return trip to Flagstaff the same as always, tired, quiet, going through the motions of supper and the evening routine. And Delia had watched her across the table with the stillness of a child who had learned that patience extracted more information than questions. At some point during the washing up, Delia said, "Something happened today." "Long day," Maeve said. "Something good, I mean." Maeve put the clean bowl on the shelf. Go to bed, Delia. You're not going to tell me. Not tonight. Delia considered this. Is it the cowboy? Maeve looked at her. Delia held up her hands. I'm just asking. Go to bed. I'm going. I'm just saying, for what it's worth. Delia paused in the doorway. She was 12 and she was smart, and she had her mother's eyes, which meant that when she looked at Maeve directly, it sometimes cost something. You deserve something good, Maeve. You've been the one holding everything together for a long time, and you never once asked for help. And I know that's who you are, but you deserve something good. So if something good happened, she stopped. I just hope you don't talk yourself out of it. Maeve looked at her sister in the doorway for a moment. Go to bed, she said. Delia went to bed. Maeve stood in the kitchen and washed the last cup and set it on the shelf and dried her hands and stood there in the quiet of their rented room with the tobacco tin under the floorboard and the window that looked onto the alley and the note she'd carried home months ago and put away, and thought about a 12-year-old who saw more clearly through walls than most adults saw through open doors. She thought about her mother. Her mother had not been a sentimental woman. She'd been practical, unsentimental, more interested in whether a thing was useful than whether it was moving. But she'd loved Maeve's father with a completeness that was quiet and evident, the kind of love that doesn't announce itself but is visible in 1,000 ordinary moments, in the way she handed him his coffee, in the way they managed difficulties together without it becoming a battle. Maeve had watched that for as long as she'd had it to watch, and then she'd lost it, and she'd told herself for years since that she was too busy for something like that, too practical, that it wasn't available to a woman in her position. She wasn't sure, tonight, whether she'd believe that or whether she'd just been afraid. She was afraid now. That was the honest thing. Not of Colt Mercer specifically. Nothing she'd seen of him suggested she should be afraid of him, but of wanting something that could be taken away, of letting the size of what she felt become visible, of being, in some fundamental way, wrong about a person, when the cost of being wrong was not something she could absorb. She thought about his face in the galley doorway, the way he'd come back to say he was sorry about the wrong thing, specifically, without softening it into something easier to say. The way he'd looked at her when she'd finally said all right, not triumphant, not relieved, just present. Like a man who had somewhere to be and had arrived. She blew out the lamp. She lay in the dark and listened to Delia breathing. She thought, you don't know this will work. She thought, you can't know. She thought, you've been holding everything together for 4 years, and you haven't been wrong yet, and the only reason you haven't been wrong is that you never bet on anything you couldn't see clearly. She thought, you can't see him clearly yet. She thought, yet. September moved through the territory in its brutal, unhurried way, and the pattern between them shifted. Not dramatically. Nothing between them ever moved dramatically, which she'd begun to understand was a quality rather than an absence. But it changed in the way that things change when a decision has been made and both people know it, even if the outward shape of things looks similar. He was still at table 2. He still ordered whatever was good. He still appeared at the service window during the slow hour, and she still came to it, but the conversations were different now, longer, less guarded, with a different quality of honesty in them. She said things she meant without calculating first whether she meant to say them. He did the same. She learned that he was afraid of very little except failure of a specific kind. Not financial failure, not the practical disasters of ranch life, but the failure of becoming someone who did not do right by the people he was responsible for. He'd watched his father manage that quietly for years and carry the weight of it alone. And he'd sworn at 19 he wouldn't be that man. And the swearing had cost him something because keeping a promise to yourself was more expensive than keeping one to another person. He learned that she had not cried when her father died, that she'd stood at the grave in the borrowed suit and felt the specific unreality of loss, the way the world refuses to look different, refuses to confirm that something essential has left it, and walked home afterward and sat at the kitchen table and made a list of what they had and what they'd need and started from there, that she sometimes wondered whether she'd done Delia a disservice by being too controlled, whether her sister should have seen more grief and less management. You did what you had to, Colt said. Everyone says that. Because it's true. It doesn't feel like enough. Most things don't, he said. Doesn't mean they weren't. She thought about that for a long time. On a Sunday in mid-September, the train hit a bad stretch of track between Winslow and Flagstaff, and the dining car lurched hard enough to send things off the shelves. Maeve grabbed the counter, caught the soup pot before it went over, heard the crash of a plate from the dining car side, and the immediate sound of raised voices. She got through the worst of it, 30 seconds of the train correcting, then slowing, then steadying, and came out from the galley to assess damage. 2 broken cups, a spilled coffee service, several passengers who had done the involuntary lurch and were now either shaken or offended or both. Harold was moving through the car with his professional calm. Delia, she knew, was wedged in the corner of the supply closet with her back against the wall, which was where she went when the train did something unusual. Colt was at table 2 with his hand braced on the table, his coffee somehow still upright, watching her come into the car with an expression she'd learned to read. "You all right?" he asked. "Fine. The soup's fine." She was assessing the car as she spoke. "Is anyone hurt?" A woman at the far table had a small cut on her palm from a broken cup. Maeve went to her, found the first aid kit Harold kept behind the serving station, handled it. When she straightened up and turned around, Colt was behind her with the broom, sweeping up the broken pieces. She hadn't asked him to do that. She looked at him sweeping her dining car floor with the same matter-of-fact economy he'd used washing her dishes in July, and she felt something in her chest do something complicated. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know." He didn't stop. "Go check on your sister." She went. Delia was fine. She was sitting in the supply closet with her book open on her knees and her hair a disaster from pressing against the wall, and she looked up when Maeve opened the door with the expression of someone who had decided not to be frightened and was committed to that decision. "I'm fine," Delia said. "I know. I'm checking. The soup's fine too. I could smell it." "Nothing burned." "Nothing burned." Delia smoothed her book. "He's sweeping, isn't he?" Maeve looked at her. "I heard the broom," Delia said. Maeve closed the supply closet door and went back to the galley. She stood at the window. Through it, she could see Colt finishing with the broom, stacking the broken pieces in the dustpan, going about it with a complete absence of theater that she found, she realized, deeply and unguardedly moving. Not because it was grand, because it wasn't. Because it was just a man sweeping a floor because the floor needed sweeping, and he was there. She had been afraid she understood now of exactly this. Not of something extravagant or complicated, of something ordinary, of someone who just showed up and did the next useful thing over and over, without keeping score, without requiring acknowledgement, without making it a performance. She'd been afraid of that because ordinary things, in her experience, were the things you could lose. Extravagant gestures were easy to brace against. They announced themselves. But this, the broom, the dishes, the note in the tobacco tin, the months of Wednesdays and Sundays, this was the kind of thing that got inside your life without you noticing until it was already there. And then you were the one with something to lose. She was already the one with something to lose. She'd known it for a while, and she was only just letting herself know it clearly. She came out of the galley while he was returning the broom to its place by the door. The car was settling back to normal around them, passengers resettling, Harold refilling coffee, the ordinary restoration of routine after a disruption. "Colt," she said. He turned. She'd planned something to say, something measured and careful, something that left room for retreat. She looked at him, and the planned thing went away, and what came out instead was the true thing. "I don't know if I can stop being afraid," she said. "I've been afraid for so long that I'm not always sure where it ends and I start. But I want to try." She stopped. "I want to try with you." He looked at her for a long moment with the desert going past behind him and the noise of the train around them and Harold pointedly at the far end of the car. "That's enough," he said. That's more than enough. I'm still going to push back when I disagree with you. I'd be concerned if you didn't. And I'm not. I can't make you promises about Maeve." He said it quietly. "I'm not asking for promises. I'm asking to be there." She looked at him. "That's it," he said. "Just let me be there." She breathed in. She breathed out. Outside, the desert was the same as it had always been, enormous and indifferent and gorgeous in its way, stretching to the edge of what a person could see and then beyond. She'd been moving through it for months, at 30 miles an hour, thinking she was passing through something on the way to something else. "Okay," she said. It was one word. It didn't feel like one word. He nodded once, and the expression on his face was not triumph, and it was not relief. It was just Colt Mercer, looking at her the way he'd looked at her from the beginning, like she was exactly what she was, and that was exactly right. She went back to the kitchen. She made it approximately 4 steps before she had to stop and press her hand flat against her sternum for a moment, because her heart was doing something it hadn't done in a very long time, and she needed a second to get used to it. Then she went back to the range, turned the heat up on the soup, and finished the afternoon service. The courtship, such as it was, did not look like anything Maeve had expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. She'd had so little experience with being courted that her reference points were vague and probably borrowed from other women's stories, the kind told at kitchen tables and over wash basins, full of flowers and formal calls, and the particular theater of a man presenting himself to a family for approval. She had no family to present himself to, unless you counted Delia, who had already approved of him with the straightforward efficiency of a child who had made up her mind months ago and was simply waiting for the adults to catch up. What it actually looked like was this. He kept riding the train on Wednesdays and Sundays, same as before. He ordered the same food, ate at the same table, appeared at the service window during the same quiet morning stretch. But the conversations were different now, and she was different in them. Less guarded, less calculating, less occupied with monitoring herself for signs that she was wanting too much. She talked more freely. She asked questions she'd been holding back. She said things that were funny sometimes, which surprised her. She'd forgotten she could be funny, that there was a dry observational quality in her that had gone mostly dormant under the pressure of the past 4 years. He laughed at the right things. Not everything. He didn't perform amusement, but when something was actually funny, he laughed with a completeness that was unreserved, and she found she liked making him do it. He came to Flagstaff for the first time in October, not on a train day. He'd sent a note through Harold the week before, still the most reliable postal system available to them, asking if she might have a free afternoon on a Saturday. She'd written back yes, though her penmanship on the reply was worse than usual because she'd written it 3 times, and the third version was still not right, and she'd sent it anyway. He arrived at 2 in the afternoon on horseback, a bay horse with a calm disposition and good manners that she noted with the involuntary assessment of someone who'd grown up around working animals. He was wearing clean clothes, not new, but recently washed and pressed with some care, and his hat was the same one he always wore, which she found reassuring for reasons she didn't fully examine. Delia answered the door before Maeve could get there, which was not a coincidence. "You must be Mr. Mercer," Delia said, with a solemnity that barely concealed her interest. "I am. You must be Delia." "I am." She looked at him with Maeve's direct assessment in a 12-year-old's face. "Maeve says you ranch outside Tucson." "That's right." "What kind of cattle?" "Mixed herd, some longhorn, some Hereford we've been bringing in." Delia considered this with the seriousness of someone who knew nothing about cattle and was not going to admit it. "That sounds like a lot of work." "It is," he agreed. "Maeve works very hard too." "I know," he said. "I've seen it." Delia appeared to find this satisfactory. She stepped back to let him in, and then Maeve was there in the doorway of the small sitting room, her coat already on, her hair done with slightly more care than usual, and the expression on her face was the complicated one she made when she was feeling something she hadn't yet classified. "You found it," she said. "Harold drew me a map." "Harold's involvement in this is getting out of hand." "He seems invested," Colt agreed. They went to the river, the Rio Salado tributary that Delia had claimed as her own territory but was willing to lend on this occasion. They walked along the bank in the October afternoon, which was gentle in the way that only October in Arizona could be. The heat finally retreated to a bearable distance, the cottonwoods along the water going yellow. They talked for 2 hours, about things they hadn't covered in the window conversations, which were always interrupted by the demands of service and schedule. He told her about his brothers, Marcus, who was 25 and built like their father and had their father's temper when pushed, and Joel, who was 22 and had a gift for the practical mechanics of ranching that neither Colt nor Marcus possessed. She told him about Kansas in winter, which was a different kind of hard than Arizona, the cold that came off the plains horizontal and without mercy, and how her mother used to stuff rags under the door, and they'd all slept in the same room through January to share the heat. She noticed, walking with him, that he stayed on the outside of the path without making a production of it. He didn't interrupt. When she said something that required thought, he gave it thought before he responded, which meant his responses were occasionally slow, but always connected to what she'd actually said rather than what he'd been preparing to say while she was saying it. She thought, this is what he's like. Not performed, not adjusted for her benefit. Just how he was. She wasn't sure whether that made it easier or harder to hold at arm's length. And then she realized she'd stopped holding it at arm's length somewhere between the cottonwoods and the bend in the river, and it was too late to go back. October turned to November. The territory cooled to something livable. Maeve had been on the railroad line for 13 months, and the routine of it, the 3 a.m. starts, the breakfast rush, the long afternoons, the return to Flagstaff in the evening, had become so familiar that she performed it with the efficiency of someone who no longer had to think about it. Her hands knew the kitchen, her body knew the rhythm. She could make biscuits in the dark, had done it once when the galley lamp went out at 4 in the morning, and she'd finished the batch by feel rather than take the time to relight it. She and Colt had settled into a pace that was neither slow nor hurried. It was its own pace, the one that fit them, and she'd stopped trying to name it or categorize it against some external standard. He came twice a week on the train. He came to Flagstaff on alternate Saturdays. She'd been to Tucson once to see the ranch, an occasion that had been more logistically complicated than emotionally complicated, which was its own kind of progress. The ranch was not grand. She'd half expected something grander based on nothing rational. He'd never suggested it was. And instead found a working property that was exactly what a working property looked like. Functional, worn in the right places, with the particular orderliness of people who couldn't afford to let things get away from them. His brothers had been polite and visibly curious, and fairly bad at concealing either quality. Marcus had shaken her hand with the look of a man conducting an assessment he'd been asked not to conduct too obviously. Joel had asked about her soup recipe within 20 minutes, which she found endearing. The ranch house was bigger than their room in Flagstaff. There was a kitchen with a proper stove, a window that looked out over open land rather than an alley, a sitting room with a fire that she'd stood next to for 10 minutes, warming her hands. She did not let herself think about it too directly. The letter arrived on a Wednesday in the last week of November, addressed to Harold Briggs, with a secondary note indicating it was to be shared with the kitchen staff. Harold brought it to her after the breakfast rush, his face arranged in the careful neutral that she'd learned meant he was carrying something he was uncertain about. She read it twice. The Southern Pacific Railroad Company was, due to changing freight route priorities and projected passenger shortfalls, discontinuing the Flagstaff to Tucson line as of January 31st. All line staff would receive 2 weeks additional pay at time of termination. The company thanked them for their service. She stood in the galley with the letter in her hand and did the math in the rapid, involuntary way she did all math now. January 31st was 10 weeks away. 2 weeks additional pay was $14. She had $11 in the tobacco tin, which she'd managed to rebuild over the past months by cutting expenses she hadn't known she could still cut. $25 total, which would cover rent through approximately April if she was careful and found something else by then. The something else was the problem. She put the letter on the prep counter and went back to work because there was still a service to run and passengers who needed to eat and a range that didn't care about her employment situation. She did not tell Colt that day. She wasn't sure why, or rather, she knew why, but couldn't examine it too directly. There was something in her that was still calibrated to handling bad news alone, to processing it and forming a plan before presenting it to anyone else, as if showing the unprocessed version of her fear was more exposure than she could manage. She told Delia that evening. Delia went quiet in a way that was not her usual considering quiet, but something heavier. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means I need to find another job." "Is there another cook position? On a different line?" "Maybe. I'll write to the Phoenix line and the Santa Fe. There's also the hotel in Flagstaff, but they pay less and the hours are longer." She kept her voice even, practical, the voice she used when things required management rather than feeling. "We have time. 10 weeks is enough time." Delia looked at her across the table. "You're going to tell Colt." "I will." "When?" "When I've figured out the plan." Delia put her fork down carefully on the edge of her plate. "Maeve, you're doing it again." "Doing what?" "Handling it alone." Making the plan first, not letting anyone help until you've already done all the hard parts yourself. Maeve looked at her. I'm not criticizing, Delia said, with the deliberate precision of someone who had been thinking about how to say a thing for some time. I know why you do it. I know it's how we survived. I'm just saying, he would want to know, not the plan, you. He'd want to know that you're scared. I'm not scared. Delia picked her fork back up. Okay, she said, in a tone that meant the opposite. She told Colt on Sunday. She did it through the service window, which was not ideal, but the train was the place where their conversations happened, and she didn't want to wait another week. She handed him his coffee and said, "The line's being discontinued, January 31st. He looked at her. Harold told me. Harold told you? This morning, I was going to ask you about it, but you seemed... I was waiting for the right time. She looked at the counter. I'm making a plan, she said. All right. I've written to 2 other lines. There's the hotel option. We'll be fine. I just wanted you to know. He was quiet for a moment. Can I say something? Go ahead. You don't have to have the plan fully formed before you tell me things. She looked at him. He was leaning slightly on the window ledge, his coffee in both hands, his expression the same one he always wore. Attentive, honest, without performance. I know, she said. I mean it. I don't need you to come to me with everything resolved. I'd like you to come to me when it's not resolved. That's harder, she said. I know it is. She turned and poured herself half a cup of coffee she didn't strictly need and stood with her back against the counter. Through the window she could see him waiting, not impatiently, just waiting the way he waited for everything, with the sense that he had decided this was worth his time and was prepared to demonstrate that without being told to. I'm scared, she said, to the counter more than to him. About the job, about starting over, about... She stopped. About us? He asked. She looked at him. About whether any of this is real enough to build on. It's real, he said. I'm real. I know that. She set the cup down. I know it in my head. It's the rest of me that's still... The rest of me has been wrong before, about what would hold. He was quiet for a moment. Then, tell me what you need. She thought about it. What she needed was not a list she'd ever been able to compose. She needed Delia in a proper school. She needed a kitchen that didn't move. She needed to stop waking up at 2 a.m. counting things. She needed to stop being afraid of the exact things she wanted. I need to know this isn't going to disappear, she said. It's not. You can't promise that. No, he said, but I can tell you that I'm not the kind of man who builds something and walks away from it. I don't know how. She believed him. That was the thing. She looked at him through the window and believed him, not because she'd decided to trust him, but because everything he'd done for 5 months had been consistent in exactly this way, and she wasn't able to find a single instance of him being otherwise. She breathed in, she breathed out. What are you thinking? She asked. He set his coffee down. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before, which was remarkable given how carefully she'd been cataloging his expressions without meaning to. I'm thinking, he said slowly, that I had a plan about timing, about doing this properly, in stages, not rushing anything. He paused. And I'm thinking that the timing is now irrelevant, and I should just say what I mean. She went still. I want to marry you, he said. I've known it for a while. I was waiting because I didn't want to push. I know how much ground I had to cover before you'd trust that. But the line closing doesn't change what I want. It just removes the reason to wait. He held her eyes. I'm not proposing because you need rescuing. I'm proposing because I want to build something with you, and I've wanted to for months, and I don't see the point of waiting any longer. The dining car was quiet around them. The desert outside was a different desert than the one she'd been watching for 13 months. The November desert, tawny and vast and somehow softer at the edges. You're doing this now, she said, through the service window. I am, he said. I'm aware it's not ideal. It's not. I don't have a ring. I didn't plan this. I know you didn't. I was going to do it at Christmas in Flagstaff with more... Stopped. It doesn't matter. What matters is what I said, not how I said it. She thought about what Delia had said. You deserve something good. She thought about the note in the tobacco tin. She thought about a man who had ridden this train for 5 months and washed her dishes and swept her floor and stood in front of a dining car full of people and said, "So I'm talking back instead. All of it, every piece of it, adding up to something that wasn't a gesture or a performance, but simply the accumulated evidence of who he was." "Ask me properly," she said. He looked at her. Then he straightened up and stood at the window and said, "Maeve Holloway, will you marry me?" Not even a question, exactly. More like a statement he was making with his eyes open. "Yes," she said. The word came out clear and steady, and it cost her nothing to say it, which was the most surprising thing. She'd expected it to cost something. The fear, the resistance, the years of careful self-sufficiency. But it came out as simply as breathing, as if it had been there the whole time waiting for her to stop arguing with it. Harold appeared in the galley doorway approximately 45 seconds later, which suggested he'd been within earshot, which was not surprising. "Congratulations," he said, to both of them equally, in his professional neutral, and then walked back out. Well, they were married in December, in Flagstaff, in the office of a justice of the peace who had a cold and kept sniffling throughout the brief ceremony and apologized for it twice. Delia stood beside Maeve in a dress that was new. Colt had insisted on that, a single extravagance Maeve had allowed, and held Maeve's coat and her own composure with equal determination until the very end, when she lost the second and buried her face briefly in Maeve's shoulder before straightening up and pretending it hadn't happened. Colt's brothers came up from Tucson. Marcus shook Maeve's hand with genuine warmth this time, no assessment in it, just welcome. Joel brought a pie he'd made himself, which was lopsided and slightly underbaked and one of the kindest things anyone had done for her in a long time. There was no grand celebration. There was coffee and Joel's pie in the justice's anteroom, and then they all went out into the cold December afternoon and stood on the street, and Maeve looked at Colt, and he looked at her, and it was the most ordinary, extraordinary moment she had ever been inside. "We should get on the road," Marcus said. "Weather's coming." "Give them 5 minutes," Joel said. Marcus looked at the sky, considered. "Fine, 5 minutes." They moved off down the street, arguing about something Maeve couldn't hear. Delia went with them, which was also not a coincidence. "Hello, Mrs. Mercer," Colt said. She looked at him. "That's going to take some getting used to." "I imagine." "I'm keeping Holloway, professionally." "That seems right." She looked up at the sky, which was the gray of incoming weather, then down at Flagstaff's Main Street, which she'd walked 100 times and was somehow different today. "I've never done anything this impulsive in my life," she said. "We've known each other 6 months. For me, that's impulsive." "I know," he said. "I'm honored." She made the sound that was almost a laugh, and then it became an actual laugh, and she put her hand over her mouth for a second, the way she did when something caught her off guard. He was smiling at her, not a broad, performed smile, just the real one, the quiet one she'd come to know as the one that meant he was genuinely happy. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. They started toward the others, walking in the same direction into the incoming weather, which was exactly right. The move to Riverside happened in January, 3 weeks before the Flagstaff line closed for good. Riverside was a town 20 miles outside Tucson, not the nearest town to the Mercer Ranch, but the one with the most traffic, the most need. It had a main street with 3 businesses on it and the significant gap where a 4th should have been, which was the space Maeve had noticed on her first visit to the property and hadn't said anything about, but which she'd been thinking about since. The ranch house was the same as she'd seen it in October, functional, worn, livable, and she moved into it with Delia and 2 trunks and the tobacco tin, which she kept now not because the dollar was still in it, but because the note was. The first month was difficult in the specific way that living with someone new was always difficult. The collision of habits, the navigation of spaces that hadn't been shared before, the moments of friction that had nothing to do with who they were to each other and everything to do with the adjustment of 2 self-sufficient people learning to account for another person in their movements. She cooked on the ranch stove and kept finding the equipment in the wrong places, because the equipment had been in those places for years before she arrived, and Colt's brothers couldn't see any reason to move it. She had a sharp conversation with Marcus about this in the second week that was more direct than she'd intended and left them both aware of where her edges were. They recalibrated. She moved the equipment. She and Colt had their first real argument in February over money. So, not the amount of it, but how to think about it, how to allocate it, whether the plan she'd built in her head over months of train kitchen economics aligned with the plan he'd been running for the ranch. They were both right about different parts of it. They were both wrong about other parts. The argument ran for 2 evenings and got genuinely uncomfortable in the middle and resolved not with one of them winning, but with a third plan neither of them had started with, which felt like the correct outcome and cost both of them something to arrive at. She told Delia about it because Delia asked directly, and Delia said, "That seems like how it should work," with the absolute conviction of someone who had been watching adults navigate things wrong for years and had opinions about the right way. "We figured it out," Maeve said. "I know," Delia said. "That's the part I meant." The restaurant opened in March. She hadn't planned to call it a restaurant. She'd planned to call it, well, she hadn't planned to call it anything because she hadn't been sure it was going to be a restaurant. It had started as a practical answer to a concrete problem. The Mercer Ranch was 12 miles from Riverside, and the ranch hands needed to eat, and Maeve was the one who was going to be cooking either way, so she might as well do it at scale. But the gap on Riverside's main street kept existing, and the building that occupied it was available for a low rent because nobody had used it in 2 years. And Colt had looked at her one afternoon in February with the careful neutrality of a man presenting an idea he was prepared to abandon if it wasn't wanted. "You could," he said, "is all I'm saying." She stood in the empty building and looked at the space. It wasn't large, room for maybe 8 tables, a kitchen in the back that was better than the train galley and worse than she'd have designed from scratch. The floor needed work. One window was cracked. The stove would need replacing. She walked to the kitchen, opened every cabinet, assessed the light, measured the counter space with her hands. "The stove goes there," she said, pointing, "and the prep counter needs to be longer. That's not enough surface." "All right," he said, "and the floor needs sanding before anything else." "Marcus can do that." "And I want a proper ice box, not the one that's in there now. That one's going to fail in summer." "We can get one from the Tucson supplier." She turned and looked at him. He was leaning in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who had gotten the answer he wanted and was being careful not to show it too obviously. "This is going to cost money," she said. "I know. More than I'm comfortable with. We have it. From the cattle drive and the fall sales, we have it. If it fails, it won't." "You don't know that." "No," he said. "But I know you, and I know food, and I know what this town doesn't have. So I'm willing to bet on it." He paused. "Are you?" She turned back to the kitchen. She thought about the range on the train, the 60 biscuits she'd made in the dark by feel, the soup she'd kept going through a lurching track in a heat that wanted to beat her. She thought about what she was good at, and how long she'd been doing it for other people's profit, and how it would feel to do it for her own. "Sand the floor first," she said. Holloway's opened on a Thursday in March with 6 tables, a menu of 4 items, biscuits and gravy, beef stew, apple cobbler, and a soup that changed by the day. And no sign over the door yet because the sign was being painted and wouldn't be ready until Saturday. Maeve was in the kitchen at 4 in the morning. Some things didn't change. She had 2 women from town helping, a widow named Ruth who needed the work and had a capable pair of hands, and Ruth's older daughter Clara, who was 17 and had the quick study quality that Maeve had found essential in kitchen help. They worked through the morning prep together, and Maeve moved through the new kitchen with the deliberateness of someone learning an instrument, the same skills, different shape, different resistance. The first customer arrived before the door was formally open, which was a cattle buyer passing through who'd smelled the biscuits from the street. He came in and asked if they were open, and Maeve said yes before she'd finished making the decision, which turned out to be the right call. By noon, they'd served 30 people. By the end of the week, they'd had to turn 3 tables away at peak hours because there wasn't room, which was a problem she had not anticipated having this quickly, and which turned out to be a remarkable problem to have. Colt said nothing about this specifically, but she caught him looking at the full dining room on the Friday evening, and his expression was the one she'd catalogued as the real one. Not pride, exactly, but something adjacent. The look of a man who had bet on something and watched it come in. "Don't," she said. "I didn't say anything." "You were about to." He shook his head. "I wasn't. I was just looking." She went back to the kitchen where Ruth was washing up and Claire was trying to calculate how much apple they'd need next week. Maeve stood in the middle of the kitchen, her kitchen, with the counter the right length and the icebox that wasn't going to fail and the stove she'd chosen herself, and felt something so unfamiliar it took her a moment to name it. It was not relief. Relief was the thing after fear. This was different, quieter, more settled. It was the feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to do, in a place that was hers. She had never felt it quite this cleanly before. She went back to work. Spring arrived and the restaurant kept running. Delia enrolled in the school in Riverside, a proper school with a teacher who had a degree and assigned real homework, and told Maeve at their first meeting that Delia was 2 years ahead of where she should be, and the only problem was going to be keeping her engaged. Maeve thanked her and went back to work and told no one how much she'd wanted to sit down in the schoolhouse hallway and put her face in her hands. The ranch ran parallel to the restaurant, two enterprises that fed into each other. Some of the beef came from the Mercer herd, and Maeve was building a kitchen garden on the south side of the ranch house that was starting to produce enough herbs and early vegetables to matter. Marcus had taken over most of the day-to-day ranch management, which suited him and freed Colt to manage the parts that needed his specific attention, which left him more time to be present in ways that the trail months had made impossible. They were learning each other in the long-form way. She learned that he had a limited patience for things that didn't work and would fix them himself before asking for help, which occasionally created situations where he'd been up half the night repairing a fence line and told no one. She told him once, sharply, that she didn't need him falling apart in a field at midnight over a fence when they could hire it done. He acknowledged this and did it again 3 months later, which she anticipated and was only moderately annoyed by. He learned that she went quiet when she was overwhelmed rather than asking for help, and that the correct response was not to ask her directly if she was all right, but to be simply and uselessly present until she was ready to talk, which was its own skill and one he developed over time. They were not perfect. They had arguments about money twice more, and about the restaurant hours once, and about the ranch expansion plan more times than either of them fully tracked. They got things wrong and said so, and fixed them, and got other things wrong later. There was a bad week in June when a supply problem hit the restaurant at the same time as a drought warning on the ranch, and they were both too tired to be good to each other. And on the Thursday of that week, she'd said something she regretted almost before it was finished, and he'd gone quiet for a long time before he said anything back. And what he said back was measured and fair, and she'd been grateful for it in a way that cost her something to admit. They fixed it. Not easily, and not without some residue, but they fixed it. That was the thing she'd been most afraid of, and the thing she most needed to know. Not whether things would go wrong, because things always went wrong, but whether they could fix them together. Whether the foundation was real enough to hold the weight of being actual people with actual flaws living an actual life. It was. She knew it was because she'd tested it, not deliberately, but inevitably, the way any real thing gets tested by real circumstances. And it had held. Okay. The sign went up over the restaurant door in April. Holloways in plain letters. Dark paint on a weathered board. Nothing fancy. And she stood on the street looking at it. The morning Harold Briggs rode into Riverside. She hadn't known he was coming. He'd written a letter that arrived the day after he did, which was typical of letters in the territory. He was retired now. The Flagstaff line closing had been the occasion. After 30 years on the railroad, he'd decided that was enough. And he'd come to see how things were and maybe have a meal if she was feeding people. She fed him. She sat across from him at the table nearest the window with her own coffee while he ate the beef stew and the biscuits. And he ate with attention, the same way he'd always moved through things, deliberately, without waste. "Well," he said finally. "Well," she said. "This is good." He gestured with his fork, meaning the food, the room, all of it. "This is very good, Maeve." She looked around the room. Ruth was clearing tables. Clara was taking an order at the back booth. Outside, Riverside's Main Street was doing its ordinary business in the morning light. "It is," she agreed. Harold looked at her with the careful neutral that she'd known for 13 months, and understood now was not neutrality at all, but a specific form of affection. The kind of affection that expressed itself through witnessing rather than declaration. "You know," he said, "when I hired you, I thought you'd last 3 months. You didn't say that. No, I thought it. What changed your mind? He put his fork down. The biscuits, he said. Third morning. I walked into the galley and you'd been on since 3, and the biscuits were perfect and you were looking out the window at the desert like you were trying to memorize it. He paused. I thought, she's not going anywhere. She needs this job too much. Maeve looked at him. You were right about that. And then, he said, about 6 months in, I thought, she doesn't need it the same way anymore. She needed it to hold things together, and she's held them, and now she's going to want something else. He picked up his coffee. I just didn't know it would look like this. She looked around the room again. The morning light was coming through the window at a long angle, catching the dust motes in the air above the tables, making the ordinary space of it look, for a moment, considered and warm and completely hers. Neither did I, she said. He stayed for 2 hours. When he left, she walked him out to his horse, and he shook her hand and said, I told you you were worth something. And she said, you told me through Harold. And he allowed a small smile. She watched him ride down the main street and then went back inside to start the lunch prep. Behind her, Colt was at the corner table with the ranch ledgers, doing the bookkeeping he'd taken on as his contribution to the restaurant's administration, making notes in his deliberate hand. He didn't look up when she came in, and she didn't announce herself. And for a moment, she just stood in the doorway of her restaurant, watching him work at the corner table, the way he'd worked at table 2 on the train, with that specific quality of settled presence that had been the first thing she'd noticed, and the thing she'd been most afraid of letting herself need. She went to the kitchen. She started the lunch prep. She made the biscuits, 60 of them, same as always, same recipe her mother had taught her, same deliberate attention to the heat and the timing and the texture. Ruth came in at 9:30 and took over the soup, and Clara came in at 10 with a list of questions Maeve answered without stopping her hands. The dining room filled at noon. It was full again by 12:15, and they turned 2 tables before 1 o'clock. Outside, the April sun was warm and reasonable, and the sign above the door said, Holloway's in plain dark letters. And the floor had been sanded, and the stove was right, and the icebox held. And Maeve Holloway stood in the kitchen she'd designed herself in the town she'd chosen, and made food that mattered, and was building, one ordinary day at a time, something that she finally and completely believed would hold. Years have a way of accumulating quietly when you're inside them. You don't notice the first few. You're too busy, too occupied with the immediate work of building, of fixing, of getting through the week, and then the month, and then the season. And then one morning you're standing in your kitchen at 4:30, same as always, and you catch yourself thinking that the light through the east window looks exactly the way it looked 10 years ago. And you realize that 10 years have passed, and you were present for all of them and somehow didn't track the distance traveled. Maeve Mercer, Holloway professionally, Mercer in every other sense, was 41 years old in the autumn of 1901, and she was standing in the kitchen of a restaurant that had grown twice since its original dimensions, with a staff of 6 and a menu that had expanded from 4 items to 14 without ever losing the quality that had made people come back for the first 4. She was at the prep counter at 4:30 in the morning, same as she'd been at 4:30 on every working morning since she was 22, and her hands knew what they were doing well enough that her mind was free to go wherever it needed to go. It went this morning to Delia. Delia was 29 now, which was still difficult to entirely believe. She'd finished school in Riverside and then, at 16, had done something that surprised everyone except Maeve, who had always known the capacity was there. She'd written a letter to a women's college in the East, described her education, described her circumstances, described what she wanted and why she was qualified for it, and waited. They'd written back with an offer that covered half the cost. Colt had covered the other half before Maeve finished asking. It had been one of 2 moments in their marriage when she'd cried in front of him without planning to, and he had not said anything about it, just put his arm around her and stayed there until she was done. Delia had gone east at 17 and come back at 22 with a teaching certificate and a sharpness to her thinking that had always been there but was now properly armed. She'd taught at the Riverside School for 4 years, then married a surveyor named Thomas Aldridge, who was quiet and careful and had the specific quality of attending to Delia that Maeve recognized and approved of. They lived in Tucson now with their 2 children, a boy of 4 named Will and a girl of 2 named Frances, called Franny, and Delia came to Riverside on Sundays when she could manage it, which was most Sundays. Thomas had once told Maeve, at a family dinner that the first thing Delia had said about her sister when they were courting was, "She was the person who held everything together when there was nothing left to hold it with. I want to be the kind of person she'd respect." He'd said it directly to Maeve, with the slight formality of a man giving credit where he thought it was due, and Maeve had looked at her plate and said, "She did most of the holding herself." And Thomas had said, "She says the same thing about you." And they'd left it there. She thought about that exchange sometimes, in quiet mornings like this one, the way history revised itself in the telling, how you could live through something and then hear how it looked from the outside and recognize it only partially, like seeing a photograph of a place you'd been and finding it both accurate and strange. The ranch had grown too. Not extravagantly, Colt was not a man who chased extravagance, but steadily, in the way of things built on sound principles. Marcus had married a woman from Tucson named Helen, who turned out to have strong opinions about fencing methods and was correct about all of them. Joel had eventually left the ranch to open a feed supply business in Riverside, which was its own kind of growth, his gift for practical mechanics finding its proper form. The Mercer land was larger now than it had been in Colt's father's time, and it was well run, and in a territory where poorly run land failed visibly and often, that meant something. She and Colt had 2 children. A boy, Thomas, not after Delia's husband, the name had just coincided, who was 15 now and had his father's quietness and his mother's stubborn streak in equal and not always comfortable measure. And a girl, Rose, who was 12 and had Maeve's dark hair and her grandmother's eyes and a personality entirely her own that had been visible from approximately the first week of her life. Rose had strong views about everything and was usually willing to share them, a quality that Maeve found simultaneously recognizable and exhausting. Raising children was the thing no one had prepared her for adequately. She'd helped raise Delia, but that was different. Delia was 8 when Maeve became responsible for her, already formed in the essential ways, and Maeve's job had been maintenance and protection and providing. Thomas and Rose were different. They were formed inside her life, came out of it, carried it with them in ways she hadn't anticipated. Thomas had her habit of going quiet when overwhelmed, and Colt's habit of fixing things before asking for help, which was a combination that had produced 3 separate incidents of him solving a problem entirely alone that everyone else was actively working on. Rose had watched Maeve run the restaurant from the time she was old enough to watch anything, and at 8 had announced she was going to have her own restaurant someday, which had caused Colt to look at Maeve across the dinner table with the careful neutral she'd once called equality, and now recognized as the specific look of a man containing his feelings out of respect. They were not easy children. She had not expected easy children. She had expected real ones, with edges and confusion and the periodic terrible certainty of adolescence, and that was what she had, and it was demanding and frequently humbling, and she would not have traded it. The morning she was thinking about all of this, the October morning in 1901, began the same as most mornings, and then shifted. Ruth had been with her for 17 years now, which was longer than some marriages Maeve could name. Ruth was 53 and moved more slowly than she had at 36. But her hands still knew what they were doing, and she had an instinct for seasoning that Maeve had come to rely on in the way you relied on a sense you hadn't been born with but had borrowed and never returned. Clara, her daughter, had moved to Phoenix years ago to be married, but she'd sent her own daughter, Ruth's granddaughter, a girl of 16 named Vera, to work at Holloway's the previous spring, and Vera had the same quick study quality as her mother, and was taking the work seriously in a way that made Maeve's chest do something specific whenever she noticed it. She was pulling the first batch of biscuits from the oven when the door opened. It was Delia, 2 hours earlier than she usually arrived on Sundays, with Franny on her hip and Will walking beside her in that determined, slightly lurching way of 4-year-olds who had decided they were managing themselves and did not require assistance. Maeve looked up. "You're early. Thomas came and got me last night." Delia set Franny down, and Franny immediately moved toward the biscuits with the directness of a child who understood priorities. "He rode out to Tucson after dark. He said, 'Papa.'" "What happened?" "He fell." Delia's voice was steady, but it cost something. "In the south field. He was fixing the fence line. Apparently he'd been out there since the afternoon, and Marcus found him at dusk." Maeve took the oven cloth off her hands. "He's at the house," Delia said. "He's awake. The doctor came last night. It's his leg. A bad break." Not the other kind of bad. Thomas stayed with him, and Marcus is there, but I thought... Maeve was already taking off her apron. Ruth, she said. Ruth appeared in the doorway with the calibrated timing of someone who had been listening and was prepared. Go, she said. I've got it. Maeve went. Oh, Brad. He was in the bedroom they'd shared for 17 years, propped on pillows, his left leg splinted and wrapped, looking, she catalogued this immediately, pale and irritated in equal measure, which was reassuring in its way. Pale was concerning, irritated was Colt. Thomas was in the chair by the window, and the look on his 15-year-old face when Maeve came through the door was one she hadn't seen before. Not frightened, exactly, but the face of a boy who had done an adult thing overnight and hadn't fully processed it yet. He'd ridden 12 miles in the dark to get Delia. He'd sat with his father through the night. He looked like someone very young carrying something very heavy and managing it for the moment by not looking at it directly. She went to Colt first because Colt was in the bed, and she put her hand on his forehead, not looking for fever, just touching him, just contact, and he covered her hand with his. The fence, he started. Marcus can do the fence. It was the section by the South Creek. The post was... Colt. He stopped. The fence can wait, she said. You cannot. He looked at her. There was something in his face that she recognized as embarrassment. A man who had been found hurt after doing something alone that he shouldn't have done alone, which was a pattern she'd spoken to him about more than once. The discomfort of being the one who needed something rather than the one providing it. She understood that feeling better than she could have explained to anyone who hadn't lived inside it for years. I'm going to be in this bed for 6 weeks, he said. I know. The fall sails, but bro, Marcus knows the fall sails. You taught him. The Northwest pasture needs what? Colt. She said it the way you said something when you meant it completely and wanted the other person to hear the completeness. Stop. I need you to stop and let us handle things for 6 weeks. He was quiet. She could see him doing the thing he'd always done. The internal accounting, the check of who was responsible for what, the specific discomfort of finding himself in the ledger under problem instead of solution. It's hard, he said finally. I know, she said. I know what it's like. You're better at it than I am. I had more practice. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent. She sat on the edge of the bed and held his hand, and they stayed like that for a moment, which was all the moment asked for. Then she turned to Thomas. He was still in the chair, watching them with a careful expression that she now recognized as the look of a boy deciding what kind of man he was going to be. He'd seen his father hurt, had ridden out in the dark to get help, had sat through the night. He was tired. He was 15. You did right, she said. He looked at her. Last night, writing to Delia, staying. She held his eyes. That was the right thing. You did it. He looked away toward the window, and his jaw worked for a second. I didn't know what else to do, he said. That's usually when you do the right thing, she said. When you don't know what else to do. He was quiet for a moment. Then, is he going to be okay? Yes, she said. Because he was, she'd talked to the doctor before coming to the bedroom, had gotten the full account, understood the damage. 6 weeks in bed, 6 weeks careful, and then himself again. He's going to be completely fine, Thomas breathed out. The particular exhalation of a person who has been holding something and can finally put it down. Go eat something, she said. Ruth made biscuits. He got up. He was taller than she'd noticed lately. Somewhere in the past year, he'd grown into his height, and she'd been too busy to mark the moment. He passed her and then stopped, briefly, and put his hand on her shoulder in a gesture that was so much his father's that she went still for a second. Then he went out. Colt watched the door close after him. He's a good kid, he said. He is, she agreed. He's yours. He's yours too. I know. She stood. Sleep if you can. I'll come back at noon. Maeve, she stopped. Thank you, he said. For not... He paused. For not making me feel worse about it than I already do. She looked at him. Did you think I would? He considered. I thought you might have the right to. I have better things to do, she said, and went back to the restaurant. The 6 weeks passed. The way 6 weeks passed when there was too much to do to track them. in segments of work and rest, and the particular rhythm of a life that had, over 17 years, become its own kind of complicated and sustaining organism. Marcus managed the fall sales with competence, and only one significant error in the cattle count that cost them less than it could have. Joel came up from Riverside twice a week to consult on the supply orders. Thomas worked the property after school with a seriousness that no one had asked him to assume, and that Maeve watched without commenting on, because commenting on it would have drawn attention to it, and he needed to do it without the weight of being seen. Rose, who had been told her father was hurt and would recover but needed quiet, interpreted this information as instruction to conduct all her opinions at a slightly reduced volume, which was the closest thing to quiet Rose was capable of, and which Maeve accepted as sufficient. Delia came every Sunday. She helped with the restaurant on the busy afternoons, falling back into the rhythm of a kitchen she'd grown up adjacent to. And she and Maeve worked side by side sometimes without talking much, which was a different kind of conversation and not the lesser kind. Colt was, as Maeve had predicted, a deeply imperfect patient. He lasted 11 days in bed before negotiating a move to the sitting room, where he managed the ranch ledgers from the armchair and held consultations with Marcus through the window because she'd instituted a rest rule after lunch that he technically adhered to by having Marcus stand outside. She found this arrangement and did not dismantle it because he needed to be useful the way she needed the stove going. It was just how he ran, and forcing him to be otherwise would have been its own kind of damage. On the fourth Sunday of his recovery, when the house was full of Delia's family, and Marcus and Helen and Joel, who'd driven up unannounced with a crate of something he claimed was useful and was probably for the party, Maeve stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her house. It was ordinary chaos. Will was on the floor with a tin soldier that had lost its paint. Franny was asleep in the corner chair with her shoes half off. Thomas was in the yard with Marcus, examining something in the fence line, and even now, even laid up, she could see Colt angling his chair to watch them through the window, his reading glasses on, one hand still on the ledger. Delia was at the table with Helen, arguing in the pleasant way they'd developed over years of family dinners. Rose was in the kitchen with Ruth making something Maeve hadn't authorized, and judging by the smell, it was going to be fine. She stood in the doorway and looked at all of it. She thought about a train. She thought about a galley kitchen that moved at 30 miles an hour and smelled like coffee and heat. She thought about a wet rag in an apron pocket and a tobacco tin under a floorboard, and a note she'd carried home one evening in August of 1883 because she couldn't bring herself to leave it behind. She still had the note. It was in a different tin now, a better one, kept in the drawer of the dresser in their bedroom. She'd read it perhaps a dozen times in 18 years, and every time she read it, it said the same thing. You're worth something. I just thought you should hear it from someone besides yourself. And every time she read it, it landed somewhere slightly different because she was someone different each time, and the words refracted accordingly. She thought about worth. This was the thing she'd spent the first 23 years of her life not understanding, and the next 18 slowly, incompletely, imperfectly learning. Worth was not something assigned from outside. She'd known that intellectually, had known it while working for passengers who couldn't see past the kitchen window, while taking the job at the railroad because there was nothing else, while building the plan that got Delia fed and herself standing upright. She'd known it the way you knew things before you understood them. She understood it differently now. Not because she'd been told differently or because success had proven something, but because she'd built something that was genuinely hers, built it from the material of what she was good at, in the company of someone who saw it clearly, over years that had required her to keep choosing it even when it was hard. And somewhere in the building of it, the things she'd been afraid of, being wrong, being lost, being someone whose worth depended on other people's recognition, had become less loud, not silent. She didn't think it ever went entirely silent, but manageable, smaller than the other things. The other things being a restaurant that was full every noon, a sister who was exactly who she was always going to be, given the chance to become it, children who were not easy and were completely themselves, a man who had told her 18 years ago through a train service window that he meant to be there and had been there every day since, including the days when being there was not convenient or comfortable or particularly fair to him. She wasn't naive about it. There were things that had cost more than she'd priced them. There were arguments that left marks. There were nights she'd lain awake tallying the gap between what she'd planned and what had actually happened, the way the old fear ran its numbers regardless of whether she invited it. There were moments of doubt and moments of exhaustion, and moments where she'd wanted to be somewhere else entirely, some easier version of her own life. But she hadn't wanted an easier version, not really. She'd wanted this version to hold, and it had held. Colt was back on his feet by Thanksgiving, moving carefully at first and then with increasing confidence as December brought him back to himself. He'd lost some weight in the bed weeks and gained it back slowly, and there was a new slight caution in the way he moved that he hadn't had before, which was the body telling the truth about being 51, which was what it was. He didn't go back to fixing things alone at dusk. Or rather, he did it once in February, and Maeve found out because Thomas mentioned it at dinner without realizing what he was revealing. And she looked at Colt across the table with a look that required no words, and he had the grace not to argue. The fence was urgent, he said. Take Marcus next time, she said. Marcus had the South herd to... Colt. He ate his dinner. Fine, he said. Thomas looked between them and made the face of a teenager filing away information about how long married people communicated. Rose, who missed nothing, watched with open interest. Is that how you argue? Rose asked. We're not arguing, Maeve said. You're not arguing, Rose said. Eat your supper, Colt said, in the mild, unmovable tone that was the only thing that reliably moved Rose in the desired direction. She ate her supper. Maeve ate hers, and under the table, Colt's hand found hers briefly. Not a gesture, not a performance, just contact. The same way she'd touched his forehead when he was in the bed and couldn't do much else. She didn't look at him. She squeezed his hand once and let go. Os. Spring came to Riverside as it always did, with the mesquite blooming and the smell of rain on dry ground and the particular quality of light that the territory reserved for March, a light that suggested possibility without promising it. Maeve opened the restaurant at 5 a.m. on the first Monday of March, the way she'd opened it for 17 years, standing in the kitchen with the range going and the morning quiet around her. Vera was there too. She'd taken on the early shift in the past year, coming in at 4:30 to start the prep work, and she moved through the kitchen now with the confidence of someone who had found her element. She'd started asking Maeve questions 2 months ago, not about specific dishes, but about the thinking behind them, the logic of a menu, the way you planned for what you had versus what you'd ordered, the difference between cooking that fed people and cooking that brought them back. Maeve answered the questions the way her mother had answered them, not with lectures, but with demonstrations. She'd put Vera's hands on the dough and show her the texture she was looking for, tell her what it felt like when it was right, explain what the wrong version told you about what had gone wrong. She talked through the soup the way she'd talked through everything, because the talking was the teaching, and the teaching was the real legacy of a kitchen. One morning in March, Vera said, "You could write it down, you know." Maeve looked up. "Write what down?" "All of it. How you think about the food, what you know." She was serious about it, not casual, not passing. "There's no one else in this county who knows what you know about running a restaurant kitchen." Maeve was quiet for a moment. "I've thought about it," she said, which was true. She'd thought about it the way she'd thought about a lot of things, at 4 a.m, in the margin of the work. "Ruth thinks so too," Vera said. "Ruth told you to say that?" "Ruth told me to say it the next time you seemed like you might actually listen." Maeve looked at her, this girl who had her mother's hands and her grandmother's timing, and felt something that was not quite amusement and not quite recognition, but lived between the two. "Mind the biscuits," she said. Vera minded the biscuits, but she was smiling, which meant she'd said what she meant to say and was satisfied. Maeve started writing in April, in a composition book she bought at the dry goods store. In the late evenings after service was done, and the kitchen was clean and the house was quiet. She wrote about the biscuits first, because the biscuits were where she'd always started. She wrote about the heat management, the texture, the flour ratio. Then she wrote about soup, about how the base was the whole story, about the way time did things to a broth that nothing else could replicate. She wrote about feeding people, about what it meant to put care into something that would be consumed and gone, why that wasn't sad, but was in fact the point. The transience was the point, the thing made to be used up completely, to nourish and vanish and leave the person changed in the small, accumulating way that good food changed you. She wrote about the railroad galley. She hadn't expected to write about it, had thought she'd write only the practical things, the recipe logic, the instruction. But it came out anyway, the way real things came out when you weren't guarding against them. The 3 a.m. starts. The wet rag. The passengers who didn't see her, and the one who did. She didn't name him. She didn't have to. She wrote about what it felt like to do something well in a place where nobody noticed, and how you kept doing it anyway, and what that cost, and what it built. She wrote about the difference between being strong and performing strength, how the performance exhausted you and the real thing sustained you. But the real thing was harder to locate, harder to trust, because you couldn't see it from the outside and you sometimes couldn't see it from the inside either. She wrote, "The hardest thing is not the work. The hardest thing is believing the work is worth doing when nobody is watching. But that's also the only version of it that means anything. The thing you do when nobody's watching is the truest measure of who you are." She read it back. It was blunt. It was true. She left it. Colt read the composition book in June, without asking. He'd found it on the kitchen table, and she hadn't hidden it, which he took correctly as permission. She came home from the restaurant to find him at the table with his reading glasses on, and the book open in front of him and his coffee cold beside him, which meant he'd been reading for a while. He looked up when she came in. She set her things down and poured herself water and waited. "The part about the galley," he said. "What about it?" "You wrote about the note." "I didn't name you." "I know." He took his glasses off. "I know you didn't. I just—" He stopped. He turned the book in his hands once, the old gesture. "It mattered to you. Still." "Of course it did. I wrote it at 2 a.m, he said. "I was in my berth, and I couldn't sleep. And I kept thinking about what that man had said to you at the window, and I thought, somebody should say something different. I thought I'd slide it under the kitchen door and get off at Tucson, and that would be it." "You didn't get off at Tucson." "No." He set the book down. "I got back on." She sat across from him at the table. The kitchen was quiet around them. The evening kitchen, different from the morning kitchen, the day's heat settling out of it. Through the window, the last light was going out of the sky in long horizontal bands. "I want to say something," he said. "All right. What you wrote in there, about believing the work is worth doing." He looked at her. "You didn't believe it when I met you. You did the work. You were extraordinary at the work. But you didn't believe it was worth anything because you couldn't see what it was worth from inside it." She held his eyes. "I know. I just want you to know that watching you figure that out, over years, all the things we've built together, it's been the best thing I've seen in my life." He said it simply, the same way he said everything that was true. "That's all." She didn't answer immediately. She sat with it the way she sat with the things that landed in the real place. Let them settle. Let them take their proper weight. "You're not bad yourself," she said. He made the sound that was his laugh, the full one. "High praise," he said. "Take it," she said. "It's what's on offer." He took it. Bam. In the October of 1901, the same October morning she'd been thinking about Delia and the years, Maeve Mercer stood in the kitchen of Holloway's at 4:30 in the morning and made biscuits. She was 41. Her hands were not the hands of a 23-year-old, and the kitchen was not the galley that moved. And outside the window was not the Arizona desert rushing past at 30 miles an hour, but the main street of Riverside, still and quiet in the pre-dawn. In a few hours, the town would wake, and the street would fill, and the restaurant would open, and people would come in and eat food that had been made with attention, and they would or would not notice that attention. And most of them would not, and it didn't matter. It had never mattered. That was what she'd spent 18 years learning and what she'd finally written down in a composition book, and what she now understood not as a lesson, but as a fact of her own nature. The same way she understood that her hands knew the biscuit dough, and her ear knew the sound of a range running right. She did the work because the work was worth doing, because care was not wasted even when it was invisible, because the 60 biscuits she'd made in the dark by feel on a train going 30 miles an hour toward a desert sunrise were as real as anything she'd ever done, and the people who ate them had been fed, and that was true whether anyone said so or not. She'd needed someone to say so once. She was honest enough to know that. She'd needed the note in the tin and the man who kept getting back on the train and the voice that said, "So I'm talking back instead," and all the Wednesdays and the Sundays and the years of someone showing up so consistently that eventually she'd stopped bracing for the moment he wouldn't. She'd needed all of it. She didn't regret needing it. Needing things was not the failure she'd once believed it was. It was the thing that made you human, that made connection possible, that turned survival into something with a different name. The biscuits came out right. They always came out right, because she had been making them for 19 years, and she knew every variable, and she paid attention, and she did not take shortcuts even when she was tired, especially when she was tired. Vera came in at 4:45 with flowers still on her coat from the ride in, her hair in a quick braid, moving already toward the prep counter with the efficiency of someone who had claimed this work as her own. "You started without me," she said. "I always start without you. I could come earlier." 4:45 is early enough. Maeve transferred the biscuits to the cooling rack. "Start the soup stock." Vera started the soup stock. Maeve began the second batch. The kitchen filled with the particular warmth of a working morning, heat and smell, and the low industry of two people who knew what they were doing. At 5, Ruth arrived. At 5:30, the two new girls came in, sisters from the other side of Riverside hired in the summer, still learning, but learning fast. The kitchen took on its proper morning rhythm, 5 people moving through a space that had been designed to hold 5 people moving. And it was not a poetry, but it was a logic. And the logic was satisfying in the same wordless way that anything working correctly was satisfying. At 6, Colt appeared in the kitchen doorway. He did this sometimes, on mornings when he was heading into Riverside for supplies or business, stopped in at the restaurant before the day properly started, had coffee, moved on. He had the same trail clothes and the same worn-in leather and the same hat, and he was 51 with gray at his temples and new lines that had appeared in the past year. And he stood in her kitchen doorway and looked at her the way he'd always looked at her, and she felt it the same way she'd always felt it. "Coffee's on," she said. "I can see that." He poured a cup and leaned against the counter out of the way he'd always been able to make himself out of the way in her space without disappearing from it. "Full house tonight?" "Saturday. Always full on Saturday." He drank his coffee. He watched the kitchen run. He didn't offer opinions about the soup or the biscuits or anything else, because he had learned a long time ago that this was her domain and his opinions were not requested, and she was not wrong about anything in here. "Thomas wants to talk to you about the Northwest grazing rotation," he said. "He can talk to Marcus. Marcus told him to talk to you." She looked at him. "Why did Marcus tell him to talk to me?" "Because it involves the kitchen garden, and Thomas thought you might want input, and Marcus thought that was a reasonable assumption. The kitchen garden is for the restaurant." "That's what Thomas said." "Then he can talk to me at dinner." "I'll tell him." He finished his coffee. He set the cup on the counter. He looked at her once more, that specific look, the one she'd cataloged for 18 years and still didn't have a single word for, and said, "Good morning, Mrs. Mercer." "Good morning," she said. She looked at him with the same thing back, the same look she'd built and learned and settled into, the one that meant everything the same as it always had. "Go do your work." He put his hat on and went. She turned back to the range. The biscuits were cooling and the soup was going and the kitchen was running the way it ran, every morning, every service, year after year. The street outside was beginning to lighten, the eastern sky doing its slow work, the pre-dawn gray pulling back from something warmer. In the dining room, Vera was setting the tables. Maeve watched her through the pass-through for a moment. This girl who was learning to do this, who was learning what it meant to put care into something that would be consumed and gone and leave a person better for it. She watched Vera set the plates with attention, straighten a chair with the small automatic care of someone who was starting to see the details without being told to see them. She turned back to her range. The life that Maeve Holloway had built was not the one she'd have designed at 23, standing on a railroad platform in Flagstaff with a 12-year-old sister and $40, and the understanding that sentiment was a luxury. It was larger than that life, harder and softer in different places, marked by things she hadn't seen coming, shaped by choices she'd made with incomplete information in the only way anyone ever made choices. It was not a perfect life. She had never wanted a perfect life, not really. She'd wanted a real one that held, one where the work was genuinely hers, and the people in it were genuinely known to her, and where the thing she built on the foundation of all those 3 a.m. mornings was something that would last beyond her. She thought it would last. She thought of Thomas watching his father through the bedroom window, learning what it meant to manage something you cared about. She thought of Rose in the kitchen with Ruth, learning that food made with attention was a form of respect for the people who received it. She thought of Delia in Tucson, teaching children with the sharpness that had always been there, giving them the chances that someone had given her. She thought of Vera straightening chairs in the dining room, learning the logic of a kitchen one morning at a time. The things you left behind were rarely the things you planned. You built a restaurant and left behind the knowledge of how to run one. You raised children and left behind whatever you'd managed to be, for good and not, in the years you had them. You loved someone for 18 years and left behind proof that it was possible, that two difficult people who had come to each other sideways through a service window on a train could build something real and sustaining and worth the cost of being afraid. The biscuits were done. She took them out. She tapped the tops. She set them on the rack. Outside, the street was fully light now, Riverside coming to its morning self, and through the window she could see the sign above the door from the inside, the letters reversed, Siawolo H, which she'd been reading from this angle for 17 years, and which still made her pause sometimes, this backward word that was her name on the front of something she'd made. She went back to work. The door opened at 6:30, first customer of the day, a rancher from the east side who came in every Saturday for the biscuits and the beef gravy, and who had never once said whether they were good, but who had not once missed a Saturday in 3 years. She plated his order. She passed it through the window. He ate it without comment. She watched him eat for just a moment through the pass-through, and she thought someone noticed. The way they always noticed, whether they said so or not. Every clean plate was a kind of saying so. Every person who came back was a kind of saying so. Every morning that began at 4:30 and moved through the work and ended with the dining room empty and the kitchen clean and tomorrow's prep already accounted for was its own kind of saying so. She had spent a long time needing to hear it. She had learned, eventually, to hear it in the ways it was actually spoken. Not always in words, not always directly, but in the accumulation of ordinary evidence that she was here and the work was real, and the life that had grown from that first hard year was worth every difficult morning it had taken to arrive at. She folded the dish towel and hung it on the hook. She started the next batch.